Welcome back to CrimeWave Radio. Before you settle in for the night, let us know where you're listening from in the comments and what time you're watching this. If you're enjoying these chilling crimes, be sure to like and subscribe. Now, let's relax, turn down the lights, and dive into tonight's disturbing cases. Story 1. One of America's most notorious serial killers. On January 4th, 1974, in the early hours of the morning, a young woman named Karen Sparks lay sleeping in her basement apartment in Seattle, Washington. She had no idea that she was about to become the first known victim of a man whose name would one day become synonymous with terror. The intruder crept into her room, carrying a heavy metal rod. Moments later, he brought it crashing down onto her skull. The brutal attack left her unconscious for 10 days, but miraculously she survived, though she would never fully recover from the trauma. Her attacker would not stop there. Over the next year, women across the Pacific Northwest began to disappear at an alarming rate. They were young, beautiful, and vanished without a trace. Their last known moments were often eerily similar. They were approached by a charming, well-dressed man with his arm in a sling or his leg in a cast, asking for help carrying books or loading his car. Many never returned. The man responsible was Theodore Robert Bundy. Ted Bundy was not the type of man anyone would suspect of being a murderer. Handsome, well-spoken, and intelligent, he had a magnetic presence that made him stand out. He was often described as charming and confident, a law student with political ambitions. But beneath that carefully crafted exterior lurked a predator. Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Louise Bundy, was unwed and young, a situation that carried immense social stigma at the time. To avoid scandal, she moved to Philadelphia and gave birth in a home for unwed mothers. For the first few years of his life, Bundy was raised believing that his mother was actually his sister, and that his grandparents were his parents. His grandfather was a violent man, known for his explosive temper. There were stories of him abusing animals and physically harming family members. Young Ted grew up in this unstable environment, but outwardly he appeared to be a normal, polite child. However, there were early signs of trouble. As a boy, he was fascinated by macabre stories and crime magazines. Some reports suggest that he once placed knives around his sleeping aunt's body, a chilling sign of what was to come. As he grew older, Bundy struggled with feelings of inadequacy. Despite his outward charm, he was deeply insecure. He never knew the identity of his biological father, and this haunted him. He also lacked the social confidence he later became known for, feeling awkward around women. However, in his early 20s, he began to cultivate a more polished and confident image, studying psychology and throwing himself into politics. He worked on a Republican political campaign and even caught the attention of Washington's governor, Dan Evans, who saw potential in the young law student. But everything changed in 1969 when Bundy fell in love with a woman named Stephanie Brooks. She was beautiful, wealthy, and came from a prestigious family. However, after a while, she ended their relationship, telling Bundy that he lacked ambition. The rejection devastated him. Bundy was crushed, but he was also determined. Over the next few years, he reinvented himself, becoming more polished, more confident, and more manipulative. He re-enrolled in school, changed his appearance, and became the charming, charismatic figure he is remembered as today. And, in a twisted act of revenge, he rekindled his relationship with Stephanie Brooks, only to coldly break up with her once she had fallen for him again. This was a turning point. Soon after, women began to vanish. In early 1974, young women in Washington and Oregon began to disappear at an alarming rate. Many of them shared striking similarities. They were college students, with long, dark hair parted in the middle. Their last known sightings were often with a man who had a cast or sling, struggling with books or asking for help. He introduced himself as Ted. Then, in July of 1974, two women, Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, disappeared on the same day from a crowded beach at Lake Sammamish. Witnesses reported seeing a handsome man with his arm in a sling, asking women for help loading a sailboat. The name he gave, Ted. That summer, police finally had a composite sketch, based on witness descriptions. The name Ted circulated among investigators, and soon a tip came in. Several people, including Bundy's ex-girlfriend and a former professor, reported that the sketch resembled Ted Bundy, a law student in Seattle. But authorities were skeptical. Bundy was a respectable young man, with no criminal record. The idea that he could be a cold-blooded killer seemed unthinkable. By late 1974, Ted Bundy had expanded his killing spree beyond Washington and Oregon, moving into Utah, Colorado, and Idaho. His methods remained chillingly consistent. He preyed on young women, often using a fake injury to lower their guard before abducting them. On the night of November 8, 1974, in Murray, Utah, 18-year-old Carol Daranch was shopping at a local mall when she was approached by a man claiming to be a police officer. He introduced himself as Officer Roseland and told her that someone had attempted to break into her car. Bundy, wearing a fake badge, convinced her to come with him to the police station. But as soon as she got into his Volkswagen Beetle, something felt off. There was no radio equipment, and when she pointed it out, Bundy's expression changed. He suddenly pulled over, grabbed a pair of handcuffs, and tried to restrain her. Carol fought back with everything she had. She managed to kick open the car door and escape, running into the street, screaming for help. A passing couple picked her up and drove her to the real police station, where she reported the attack. For the first time, Bundy had left behind a living witness. That same night, Bundy attempted another abduction. 17-year-old Deborah Kent vanished outside a high school theater in nearby Bountiful, Utah. She was never seen again. Police quickly connected the two cases, and Carol Daranch's description of her attacker matched previous witness reports of the mysterious Ted. The walls were beginning to close in. On August 16, 1975, Bundy was driving through a residential neighborhood in Granger, Utah, when a patrolling officer noticed his car idling suspiciously. The officer attempted to pull him over, but Bundy sped off, leading police on a short chase before finally surrendering. Inside his Volkswagen Beetle, police found masks, rope, handcuffs, a crowbar, and a pantyhose mask. A collection of tools clearly intended for abduction and murder. While the items alone weren't enough to hold him, detectives compared his car to descriptions given by witnesses in the missing persons cases. Carol Daranch was brought in for a lineup, and when she saw Bundy, she immediately identified him as her attacker. With her testimony, Bundy was officially charged with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault. For the first time, Ted Bundy was behind bars, but it wouldn't last long. Bundy's trial for the Daranch kidnapping began in February 1976, and despite his efforts to represent himself and project an air of innocence, he was found guilty. The judge sentenced him to 1 to 15 years in prison. Meanwhile, investigators in Colorado were building a murder case against him for the death of Karen Campbell, a 23-year-old nurse who vanished from a ski resort. He was extradited to Colorado to stand trial. But while awaiting his court date in June 1977, Bundy made his first daring escape. He'd been allowed access to the Aspen Courthouse Law Library to prepare his defense. While left unshackled and briefly unattended, Bundy took his chance. He climbed out of a second-story window and vanished into the mountains. For 6 days, he survived in the wilderness, breaking into cabins, stealing food, and even changing his appearance. But without proper supplies, he was soon exhausted. He attempted to return to Aspen, but was caught by police while driving a stolen car. By December 1977, Bundy was being held in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, but he was already planning his next escape. This time, he was determined not to be caught. Over several weeks, Bundy managed to saw a hole in the ceiling of his jail cell using a small hacksaw blade. He carefully lost weight to fit through the small opening, and even stockpiled books under his blankets to create a dummy in his bed. On the night of December 30th, 1977, while most of the jail staff was out celebrating the holidays, Bundy crawled through the hole in the ceiling, made his way to the warden's apartment, and slipped out through the front door. By the time guards noticed he was gone, he had already stolen a car and driven out of town. This time, he didn't stay in the mountains. Bundy fled 1,500 miles south to Florida, where he would commit his most brutal and shocking crimes yet. By January 1978, Bundy had made his way to Tallahassee, Florida, and took refuge at a boarding house near Florida State University, using the alias Chris Hagen. He attempted to blend in, but the control he once held over his life was unraveling. Bundy had no money, no support system, and was increasingly desperate. He stole food, shoplifted, and spent his days aimlessly watching TV. But the urge to kill had not left him. In the early morning hours of January 15, 1978, at around 2:45 a.m., Bundy broke into the Chi Omega sorority house near the Florida State University campus. Armed with a log from a firewood pile, he moved through the house room by room, launching a merciless attack on 4 young women within minutes. Margaret Bowman, 21, was his first victim. He strangled her with a pair of pantyhose and beat her so viciously that her skull fractured. Lisa Levy, 20, suffered a similar fate. She was brutally beaten, strangled, and sexually assaulted. Kathy Kleiner, 21, and Karen Chandler, 21, were also attacked, suffering severe skull fractures and broken jaws, but both miraculously survived. Bundy fled before anyone could catch him, but his rampage wasn't over. Just 1 hour later, he broke into another apartment, just a few blocks away, and attacked Cheryl Thomas, 21. She suffered a broken jaw, dislocated shoulder, and permanent hearing damage, but she too survived. Another witness to his growing list of victims. For the first time, Bundy had acted without his usual careful planning. The murders were reckless, chaotic, and left physical evidence behind. The police knew they were dealing with a serial predator, but they had no idea who he really was. Bundy vanished after the Chi Omega attacks, but he wasn't done killing. On February 9th, 1978, he drove to Lake City, Florida, where he spotted 12-year-old Kimberly Leach outside her school. She was supposed to meet a friend in the gym, but she never arrived. Witnesses later recalled seeing a strange man leading her toward a white van. For weeks, investigators searched for Kimberly, but it wasn't until Bundy's arrest that they learned her fate. Her body was found partially decomposed in a rural area, a final, tragic victim of a man who had evaded justice for too long. On February 15, 1978, just 6 days after Kimberly's disappearance, Bundy's luck ran out. In Pensacola, Florida, police officer David Lee noticed a suspicious Volkswagen Beetle loitering outside a stolen vehicle check. When he pulled the driver over, Bundy fought back viciously, trying to flee. After a brief struggle, the officer wrestled him to the ground and placed him under arrest. Bundy refused to identify himself, but inside the stolen car, police found stolen credit cards and suspicious items linking him to past crimes. When they finally fingerprinted him, the truth was revealed. They had captured one of the most wanted men in America. The authorities now had Bundy in custody, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. Bundy faced 2 separate trials in Florida, one for the Chi Omega sorority murders, and another for the abduction and murder of Kimberly Leach. Unlike other killers who might have shied away from the spotlight, Bundy relished the attention. He refused legal counsel and insisted on representing himself, believing his intelligence and charm could sway the jury. In June 1979, the trial for the Chi Omega murders began. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence against Bundy, including bite mark impressions from Lisa Levy's body, which matched his teeth exactly. Several survivors testified against him, including Cheryl Thomas, who recounted the night of her attack. Throughout the proceedings, Bundy acted more like a showman than a defendant. He cross-examined witnesses, flirted with reporters, and even proposed marriage to Carol Ann Boone, a woman who inexplicably believed in his innocence. But the jury wasn't fooled. After 6 hours of deliberation, on July 24, 1979, Ted Bundy was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to death by electric chair. However, the trials weren't over. He still had to answer for the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. In January 1980, Bundy stood trial again, this time for the murder of Kimberly Leach. Unlike his first trial, He seemed visibly shaken. The case against him was irrefutable. Witnesses had seen him with Kimberly. Fibers from her clothing were found in his van, and the horror of her murder was impossible to ignore. This time, Bundy broke down in tears, a rare moment of emotional vulnerability. But it was too late for sympathy. He was found guilty once again and sentenced to a second death sentence. For nearly a decade, Bundy exhausted every possible appeal, delaying his execution for as long as he could. As his execution date drew near, he finally began confessing to multiple murders, admitting to over 30 killings across multiple states. On the morning of January 24th, 1989, after years of delays, Ted Bundy was finally led to the electric chair at Florida State Prison. At 7:16 a.m., the switch was flipped, and Ted Bundy was pronounced dead. His reign of terror had finally come to an end. Story 2. The Dreading Case of J.C. On the 10th of June, 1991, J.C. Lee Dugard was an ordinary 11-year-old girl living in South Lake Tahoe, California. A bright and happy child, she had dreams and aspirations, a loving family, and a promising future ahead of her. But that ordinary summer morning would mark the beginning of a nightmare that would span nearly 2 decades. It was just after 9 a.m. when J.C. set off to catch the bus to school. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, dropped her off at the end of their street near the bus stop, where she would typically wait for the school bus to take her to Suzanne Middle School. On this particular day, Carl had a strange feeling and decided to remain in his car, watching her from a distance. As J.C. stood alone at the bus stop, a gold-colored car slowly approached. Philip Garrido, a man in his late 40s, was driving, accompanied by his wife, Nancy Garrido. The couple had been living in the area and had a history of odd behavior, but no one suspected they would soon become central figures in an unspeakable crime. As they approached J.C., Philip Garrido pulled over and, without warning, grabbed her. He used a set of handcuffs to restrain her and forced her into the back of his car. The events unfolded in a matter of seconds, and Carl, who had been watching from a distance, was too far away to intervene in time. He saw the car drive off with his stepdaughter inside, but it was too late to stop them. In the chaos that followed, Carl immediately contacted the police. Authorities began searching the area for J.C., but no trace of her was found. Over the next few days, the search for the missing girl intensified. In the months and years that followed J.C.'s disappearance, her family struggled to make sense of the unthinkable. Her mother, Terry Probin, and stepfather, Carl, were devastated by the loss, unable to understand why their young daughter had been taken. The community was equally shaken. How could a child vanish from a quiet suburban neighborhood in broad daylight, in what seemed like an ordinary moment of routine? As time went on, hope began to wane. Despite constant efforts from law enforcement, J.C.'s case soon became a cold case. The investigation was relentless but led to few leads, and the details of her abduction remained a mystery. All the while, the Garridos maintained a low profile, and no one suspected the horrors that were unfolding just a short distance away. Philip and Nancy Garrido were not strangers to law enforcement. Philip had a criminal history and had served time for the rape and kidnapping of a woman in the 1970s. While in prison, he had been classified as a sex offender, and his record was well known. After his release, he went on to live a life of seclusion with his wife, Nancy, who seemed equally as peculiar. They lived in a modest home in Antioch, California, but for nearly 2 decades, no one suspected the couple of being involved in such a heinous crime. During the time of J.C.'s abduction, Philip and Nancy were living under the radar, engaging in odd religious and spiritual practices. They were known to visit churches, but their interactions with others were described as being distant and unusual. Neighbors saw little of them, and the police did not connect the couple to the missing girl. For 18 years, J.C. Dugard was held captive in a secret compound on the property of Philip and Nancy Garrido. The couple's home in Antioch, California was ordinary enough from the outside, but what lay beyond the unassuming walls was anything but. Philip and Nancy had created a private, isolated world in the backyard, one that was built to imprison J.C. and keep her away from the outside world. At first, The compound seemed like a small, makeshift area that might have been overlooked by neighbors. But it was much more than that. In the far corner of the backyard, hidden by fences, a small, soundproof shed had been constructed, where JC was confined. The space was cramped and filthy, with little to no light. It was here that she spent the first days of her captivity, unable to escape or communicate with anyone. In the early days of her captivity, JC was isolated from any form of human connection. Philip Garrido, who had been convicted of kidnapping and raping a woman years earlier, used the same tactics to manipulate and control JC. He would make threats, both physical and emotional, ensuring she felt entirely dependent on him. Over time, JC began to believe that there was no escape. She was told by Philip and Nancy that no one was looking for her, that she was forgotten. Philip, in particular, maintained a manipulative relationship with her. He would alternate between being kind and threatening, making her believe she had nowhere to turn. Despite the physical and psychological torment, JC's inner strength never completely wavered. She did everything she could to survive in her isolated world, holding on to memories of her family and the life she had before the abduction. As the years went by, she began to adapt to her new reality. She was forced into a life of secrecy, but her resilience kept her going. JC's captivity took an even darker turn when she gave birth to 2 daughters. At the ages of 14 and 18, JC became a mother, both to girls fathered by Philip Garrido. The births were not her choice, but they were an inevitable consequence of the horrific circumstances in which she found herself. Philip used these children to further manipulate JC. He would often remind her that the girls were the only thing she had left, and he attempted to control their lives as much as he controlled hers. JC loved her children, but the situation in which they were born was as grim as one could imagine. Despite the trauma and isolation, JC did everything she could to protect her daughters, ensuring they were not subjected to the same kind of abuse she endured. She created a semblance of normalcy for them, knowing that she couldn't let them grow up in the same cruel environment in which she had been trapped. For JC, her children became her lifeline, the only reason she found the strength to keep going. In 2009, 18 years after JC's abduction, Philip Garrido and his wife Nancy were approached by authorities under strange circumstances. Philip had been visiting a University of California, Berkeley campus, handing out religious flyers and engaging in odd behavior. He had been questioned before, but nothing stood out at the time. However, in August of that year, an event would occur that would turn the entire case around. Philip had been brought in by 2 parole officers who noticed something strange about him. They questioned him about his behavior, and, as they spoke, JC and her daughters were present in the car with him. It was at this moment that JC's life would change forever. She and her daughters had never been seen by the public in nearly 2 decades, and their existence had been kept a secret. Philip's strange behavior and the presence of the young girls in the car raised suspicions. But it was JC who, at that moment, saw an opportunity. During the conversation, JC quietly revealed to the parole officers that she had been abducted and had been held captive for years. The officers, realizing the gravity of the situation, immediately contacted the police. When JC finally came forward, it was with a mixture of fear, relief, and disbelief. She was free, but she was also afraid. She feared that if she spoke out, Philip might hurt her or her daughters. It took time for her to trust the officers, but eventually, they managed to convince her that she was no longer in danger and that they would protect her. News of her rescue spread quickly, and JC was taken to safety, reunited with her family. Her mother, Terry Probin, who had been searching for her daughter for 18 years, was overwhelmed with emotion. She could hardly believe that the daughter she had thought was lost forever was finally home. JC's recovery was long and difficult, but she slowly readjusted to life. She underwent therapy and sought to rebuild her relationship with her family. For years, she had been denied the simple joys of childhood, and now she had to find a way to reclaim the years that were taken from her. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested shortly after JC's rescue. Philip was charged with kidnapping, rape, and numerous other offenses related to his long history of abuse and manipulation. Nancy, though complicit in the crimes, was later convicted of child abuse. In the years following her rescue, JC Dugard made the decision to speak publicly about her ordeal. She wrote a memoir, A Stolen Life, in which she detailed the abuse and trauma she endured during her captivity. Story 3. The New York Scammer. In the world of high finance, few names were as synonymous with trust and success as Bernie Madoff. Born in 1938 in New York City, Madoff's rise from humble beginnings to becoming a Wall Street legend is a tale of both ambition and deception. For decades, he was considered a savvy and reliable businessman. He was the founder of Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities, LLC, a firm that grew into one of the most prestigious in the financial world, attracting an elite clientele that included celebrities, charitable organizations, and institutional investors. Madoff's firm was a household name, and for many, his reputation was untarnished. He was widely respected, not only for his business acumen but for his involvement in financial regulatory bodies, including serving as chairman of the Nasdaq. His success seemed indisputable. However, hidden behind his polished image and glowing reputation was a massive Ponzi scheme that would eventually make him one of the most infamous figures in modern financial history. Madoff's rise in the financial world was based on a simple yet effective formula: trust. He had a gift for making people believe in his ability to generate steady, high returns on their investments. Through a combination of charm, secrecy, and exclusivity, he convinced his clients that they were benefiting from an exclusive and profitable trading strategy. Over time, Madoff's clients came to view him as untouchable, and with each glowing report of his firm's financial success, the stakes grew higher. What made Madoff's scheme particularly effective was the lack of transparency in his operations. Investors trusted that they were receiving regular, guaranteed returns. But in reality, Madoff was not actually investing the money at all. Instead, he was using the funds from new investors to pay the returns of older investors, creating the illusion of a highly profitable business. For years, this scheme continued to grow, with Madoff living a lavish lifestyle, funded by the money of those who had been taken in by his deceit. By the early 2000s, Madoff's firm had grown into one of the largest and most trusted financial institutions in the world, managing billions of dollars in assets. His clients, many of whom were wealthy individuals and institutional investors, seemed to be profiting handsomely from their investments. Madoff's firm became so well known that even in the midst of global financial turbulence, no one questioned the legitimacy of his operation. The scheme's success was also aided by Madoff's ability to maintain a low profile. Unlike other hedge fund managers who openly advertised their returns or sought attention in the media, Madoff preferred to operate quietly behind the scenes. He had built a reputation as someone who was above reproach, which allowed him to continue perpetrating the fraud for years without raising suspicion. But, despite all of his success, cracks in the foundation of Madoff's empire began to show in the years leading up to his downfall. By 2008, the global financial crisis was putting pressure on financial markets around the world. Many investors began looking to their portfolios, concerned about the stability of their investments. For Bernie Madoff, the turbulence in the markets was both an opportunity and a threat. While the crisis hurt many investors, Madoff's firm had largely been insulated from the downturn thanks to his consistent and supposedly high returns. But this stability was an illusion, and in reality, the scheme was teetering on the brink of collapse. As the market continued to falter, Madoff began to experience massive withdrawals from his firm. Investors, fearing the worst, began pulling out their money, and the cash flow necessary to keep the scheme running started to dry up. Madoff's firm relied on the continuous influx of new investments to meet withdrawal demands. But with fewer people investing and more people wanting to cash out, the pressure on the firm became overwhelming. Eventually, the facade of success that Madoff had carefully crafted began to crumble. In December 2008, the full extent of Madoff's fraudulent activities came to light. The U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, was alerted to the fact that Madoff had been running a Ponzi scheme for years, and the investigation quickly revealed that Madoff had defrauded investors of billions of dollars. The numbers were staggering. Estimates suggested that Madoff's firm had stolen as much as $65 billion from his clients, making it the largest financial fraud in history. The vast majority of Madoff's clients were unaware that they had been duped, and many of them had lost their entire life savings. The collapse of Madoff's empire caused shockwaves throughout the financial world, leaving investors devastated and reeling from the realization that they had been swindled by a man they had trusted. When Madoff was arrested, his reputation as a financial genius was shattered. The once respected businessman was now facing charges of securities fraud, money laundering, and theft on an unprecedented scale. It became clear that Madoff had lived a double life, deceiving not only his clients but the entire financial world. In the wake of Bernie Madoff's arrest, the financial world was left to pick up the pieces. For many, the revelation of Madoff's scheme was a devastating blow. Clients who had invested millions, including high-profile individuals, institutions, and charities, found themselves at the mercy of the legal system. Some of Madoff's victims were left without their life savings, and many of his clients went into bankruptcy, while others faced long and costly legal battles to recover their funds. The fallout from the scandal was far-reaching. Madoff's family, including his two sons, also felt the consequences of his actions. His sons initially stood by him, but were later drawn into the scandal, with one of them even taking his own life in the aftermath. Madoff's wife, Ruth Madoff, faced public humiliation, and was left to contend with the loss of her wealth and the damage done to her family's reputation. Madoff's trial began in 2009, and his defense was simple. He had acted alone, and there had been no complicity from others in his firm. However, the prosecution argued that Madoff had perpetrated a scheme of unparalleled scope and sophistication, targeting wealthy individuals, pension funds, and charities. In June 2009, Madoff pled guilty to 11 felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, and money laundering. The judge sentenced Madoff to 150 years in prison, ensuring that he would never be released. His sentencing marked the end of a long and tragic chapter in the history of American finance. Story 4. Maury Travis. On the surface, Maury Travis seemed like an ordinary man. He lived a quiet life in St. Louis, Missouri, working as a bartender, and he had a relatively unremarkable presence in his community. Yet, beneath this facade lurked a horrifying reality. Travis was the serial killer responsible for a string of brutal murders in the early 2000s, known primarily for his chilling murder videos, which were discovered posthumously. Maury Travis's story begins like so many others, with a troubled past, some red flags ignored, and the gradual development of violent tendencies. Born in 1965 in St. Louis, Travis's early life was relatively uneventful, at least from an outside perspective. He was raised in a lower-income neighborhood, and by all accounts, he wasn't particularly exceptional in any regard. However, there were whispers of trouble, issues with authority, a disregard for rules, and a general sense of dissatisfaction with the world around him. Travis's violent tendencies emerged gradually. He had previous brushes with the law, including arrests for domestic violence. These isolated incidents went unnoticed by the broader community, but for those who were close to him, they marked the beginning of something darker. Friends and family recalled that Travis always had an air of unpredictability about him. He could be charming and charismatic, but there was always an underlying sense of danger that those around him couldn't shake off. It wasn't until 2001 that Travis's true nature began to show. He began abducting women from the streets of St. Louis, luring them to his home where he held them captive. During this period, he became increasingly more brazen, abducting victims with little fear of detection. His motivations were unclear at first, but there was something uniquely horrifying about the way he treated his victims. In 2002, the first confirmed victims of Maury Travis began to surface. The bodies of 2 women were discovered in a remote area, left to be found in abandoned or secluded locations. At first, law enforcement had no reason to believe they were connected, but they soon realized the brutal nature of the murders had a common thread. Both women had been strangled, their bodies disposed of with disturbing care. This pattern would continue in the years that followed. What made Travis's crimes even more chilling was his penchant for videotaping his murders. These tapes, which he made in a cold, detached manner, provided an insight into the mind of a killer. But they were also an eerie record of his monstrous actions. Each video was horrifying in its own right, showing his victims in their final moments as they were tortured and killed. These videos were later found in his home and would become a central part of his legacy, providing a glimpse into his psyche, as well as evidence of the horrors he inflicted on his victims. The authorities were still struggling to find any solid leads. Despite a growing sense of unease in the St. Louis area and mounting pressure to solve the case, the killer remained elusive. But in early 2004, the investigation took a crucial turn, and Maury Travis's name would soon be tied to the grisly killings. It all started with an anonymous tip. A local caller claimed to have seen something suspicious in a neighborhood near where the bodies had been dumped. The authorities were cautious, unsure of how much weight to give the tip, but they followed up on it. What they uncovered was something they had never expected. While searching Travis's home for more clues, investigators discovered several videotapes hidden away in his apartment. The tapes were nothing short of horrifying. On them, Maury Travis could be seen tormenting and killing his victims, with the cameras capturing every cruel detail. Forensic experts later confirmed that the tapes were made between 2001 and 2003, matching the timeline of the murders. But the most chilling discovery was that Travis had been using these tapes as a way of documenting his crimes, treating them as if they were trophies. The tapes were a crucial piece of evidence, but it wasn't just the footage that made the authorities' blood run cold. On several of the tapes, Travis could be heard speaking directly to the camera, often offering chilling commentary on his victims and the violence he was inflicting. This wasn't a random killer trying to escape detection. Travis had meticulously documented each murder, his narcissism and control over his victims evident in the way he operated. His behavior seemed calculated, as though he took pleasure not just in the act of killing, but in watching the terror unfold before him. In addition to the tapes, investigators found several photographs of Travis posing with his victims. Some of these pictures depicted him smiling or standing proudly over the bodies of the women he had murdered. These images further solidified the case against him and provided a deeper insight into his psyche. Travis was no stranger to the violence. He seemed to thrive on it. As investigators delved deeper into Travis' life, they uncovered another disturbing element to his criminal behavior: his involvement in online communities. Travis had been active on chat rooms and forums where he interacted with other individuals who shared similar interests. What was particularly disturbing was that he often bragged about his ability to avoid detection and spoke openly about his violent tendencies. It became clear that, much like his taped confessions, these online conversations were another way for Travis to showcase his power and control over his victims. Through these online interactions, investigators were able to connect the dots between Maury Travis and the murders. His online persona, combined with the chilling nature of the murder tapes, painted a vivid picture of a man who was deeply disturbed, seeking both gratification and attention through his crimes. As the case progressed, authorities were able to trace his interactions with other users back to his personal email and computer, confirming his identity and linking him directly to the killings. On the 10th of June 2004, Maury Travis was arrested at his home in St. Louis, Missouri. As the authorities swarmed his apartment, Travis was taken into custody without resistance. The arrest was relatively uneventful, but what would follow was a lengthy and intense period of interrogation. Authorities needed answers. Why had Travis committed these heinous murders, and what drove him to keep such detailed records of his crimes? During his interrogation, Travis was surprisingly calm. The police were able to uncover more details about his personality and mindset, although he remained evasive and unapologetic about his actions. When asked about the murders, Travis was eerily indifferent. He claimed that he had committed the crimes out of a desire to feel powerful, to take control over others in a world that he felt had mistreated him. At times, he would speak in a detached manner, as if recounting the actions of a different person rather than owning up to his own atrocities. The police were left with the chilling realization that Maury Travis's detachment from his crimes was a sign of his complete lack of empathy. He had planned and executed the murders with meticulous care, yet he felt no remorse for the lives he had destroyed. As Travis spoke, he continued to display a disturbing level of arrogance, even suggesting that he had gotten away with his crimes for so long because he was too smart for the authorities. Maury Travis's trial began in early 25, drawing significant attention due to the disturbing nature of his crimes. Despite his defense team's efforts, the evidence against Travis was overwhelming. The physical evidence, including the tapes and photographs, were enough to secure a conviction. The jury deliberated for several days before returning a guilty verdict on all charges. Maury Travis was found guilty of the brutal murders of at least 12 women, although some investigators believed the number was even higher. The case against him was clear-cut, and the public reaction to his conviction was one of relief, mixed with horror at the extent of his crimes. The judge sentenced Travis to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The sentence was seen as just, given the gravity of his actions and the pain he had caused to the families of his victims. Travis, however, showed no visible emotion as he was led away to serve his sentence. Story 5: The Great Train Robbery. On the 8th of August 1963, the British public was about to witness one of the most daring and audacious heists in history. The Great Train Robbery. The plan had been meticulously conceived, and it involved a group of skilled criminals who would take advantage of an old-fashioned yet highly lucrative system. At the time, the Royal Mail was a vital part of the British economy, and it transported large sums of money across the country. What made this robbery so remarkable was the precision and coordination with which it was carried out, leaving the authorities stunned and the nation in disbelief. The robbery itself took place on the Glasgow to London mail train, a high-priority express known for transporting large amounts of cash. The criminals involved in the plot had spent months planning every detail. They knew that the train would stop at a particular signal box before reaching its destination, allowing them a narrow window of opportunity to strike. The robbers were aware that this was a prime chance to make their move, as the train carried millions of pounds worth of cash, mostly from the proceeds of banknotes that were to be delivered to London. What they hadn't accounted for, however, was the sheer scale of their crime, and the complications that would follow. The mastermind behind the robbery was a man named Bruce Reynolds, a notorious criminal who had spent years involved in smaller heists. Reynolds had assembled a team of 11 men who each brought their own unique set of skills to the table. Together, they formed a crew of highly experienced robbers, but what set them apart was their ability to maintain a low profile and carry out the heist without attracting attention. They understood the importance of being unnoticed and calculated, and it was this expertise that made them so dangerous. As the night of the robbery approached, the crew made their final preparations. They had an inside man working for the British Transport Police, which gave them valuable intelligence on the train's movements and security measures. This inside source was a vital part of the operation, providing information that would prove crucial to the success of the heist. The criminals used the information to learn the exact timing of the train's journey, allowing them to stage their ambush at the perfect moment. On the evening of the heist, the train departed from Glasgow, heading south toward London. The crew of robbers positioned themselves along the route, waiting for their opportunity to strike. As the train neared the remote area near Ledburn, they sprang into action. A strategically placed signal box on the route had been rigged by the robbers, causing the train to stop. The robbers used this moment of delay to their advantage, boarding the train with great precision and without raising alarm. The robbers were dressed in railway uniforms, which allowed them to move freely and without suspicion. They overpowered the crew, including the train driver and the guard, who were tied up and locked away in a compartment. This moment was crucial because it ensured that there would be no immediate alarm raised. The robbers had also ensured that the train was cut off from communicating with the outside world, making it impossible for the authorities to intervene in time. The criminals then made their way to the luggage compartment, where they knew the money was stored. Inside the cargo hold, they found 120 bags containing a staggering amount of cash, including banknotes, checks, and other valuables. The total haul was estimated to be around £2.60 million, equivalent to over £50 million today's money. However, the robbers did not immediately stop to count their spoils. They worked quickly and efficiently, loading the money into their getaway vehicles before the authorities had a chance to catch on. What made this robbery unique was not just the amount of money involved, but the methodical way in which it was executed. The robbers were well prepared, and every detail had been thought through. Even though they had a small window of opportunity, they were able to complete the heist with remarkable speed and precision. Their getaway vehicles, including trucks and vans, had been carefully planned to ensure that they could quickly escape the scene without drawing attention. At this stage, it seemed like the perfect crime. The robbers had successfully pulled off the heist without raising any alarms, and they had the money in their possession. However, what the robbers didn't anticipate was the sheer determination of law enforcement and the eventual breakdown of their plan. Though the criminals had managed to escape the scene, they had left behind a series of clues that would eventually lead to their undoing. As the police began investigating the crime, they found small details that would later help piece together the puzzle. The robbers' meticulous planning had paid off in the short term, but it was only a matter of time before their blessings would run out. Once the robbers had successfully fled the scene, leaving the train and its crew behind, the enormity of what had occurred slowly began to sink in. Authorities were immediately alerted to the robbery, and a full investigation began in earnest. The British Transport Police were the first on the scene, followed by local law enforcement and specialized robbery units. Despite their initial shock at the scale of the theft, the authorities knew they had to act quickly to catch the criminals before they disappeared into the shadows. Early evidence seemed to suggest that the robbery had been well planned and executed with precision. As investigators examined the scene, they noticed several clues that, although seemingly insignificant at first, would eventually piece together the puzzle. A particularly telling clue was the signal box that had been tampered with, which showed signs of deliberate interference. This indicated that the robbers had an intimate knowledge of the train's movements and the systems in place along the rail. A key breakthrough came when investigators began interviewing the train crew. The robbers had gone to great lengths to ensure that no alarms were raised, but there was still one small mistake they had made. The train's guard had been tied up but managed to free himself shortly after the robbery, allowing him to give a description of the robbers, even though they had been wearing railway uniforms. This testimony would serve as a critical piece of the puzzle, although investigators knew they were facing a long road ahead. While the investigation was in full swing, the robbers, who had thought their plan was flawless, were already starting to feel the heat. The money was substantial, but so was the risk, and the weight of the crime began to take its toll. In the following days after the heist, the criminals began to make mistakes, allowing law enforcement to slowly narrow down their options. Some members of the criminal gang began to show signs of panic, making rash decisions that would eventually lead to their undoing. For example, one of the robbers, James Big Jim Hussey, had tried to launder some of the stolen money at a bank. He was quickly caught on security footage, a critical mistake that would alert the authorities to the involvement of the gang. Despite efforts to remain anonymous and hide their identities, the robbers' increasing nervousness and suspicious behavior began to reveal cracks in their seemingly foolproof plan. The pressure on the robbers escalated further as rumors began to circulate within the criminal underworld. Law enforcement had their sights set on a number of individuals, many of whom had previously been involved in similar heists, or had connections to the British criminal network. The growing suspicion made some members of the gang uneasy, and the heat on them began to intensify. Those who had been involved in the robbery started to separate, realizing that their past actions were catching up to them. As weeks passed and the investigation progressed, detectives began to focus on a small network of individuals who had been under surveillance for months. Slowly, key members of the gang were arrested, one by one. Through careful surveillance and intelligence gathering, police managed to identify Bruce Reynolds as the mastermind behind the heist. Other members of the crew were also captured, including Brian Field, Roger Corddry, and several others who had played pivotal roles in the planning and execution of the robbery. The arrests were coordinated, and detectives had to work quickly to gather the stolen money before the criminals had a chance to hide it. The total amount recovered was estimated to be around £2.30 million, though a portion of the stolen money was never found. Some of the robbers had stashed their share of the loot in various safe houses, or attempted to launder it in different ways. But much of the stolen cash had already been spent or hidden away in an attempt to evade authorities. Bruce Reynolds and his crew were ultimately arrested and charged with a variety of offenses, including robbery, conspiracy, and assault. While the authorities were able to recover a significant portion of the stolen money, they were never able to fully recover everything that had been taken. Despite the spectacular success of the robbery, many members of the gang were caught, and justice was served in the end. Reynolds, who had once been hailed as a criminal mastermind, was eventually convicted and sentenced to 25 years in prison. His role as the leader of the heist would cement his place in criminal history. Other members of the gang received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. The aftermath of the robbery saw the dissolution of the gang, as some of the members turned on each other, hoping to secure lighter sentences in exchange for testimony against the others. Story 6. A tragic murder. On the evening of July 3, 1965, a 16-year-old girl named Sylvia Likens was subjected to unimaginable horrors that would ultimately lead to her death. Sylvia, along with her younger sister Jenny, had been left in the care of Gertrude Banasiewski, a woman they barely knew. In Indiana, the two girls had been placed in Gertrude's home after their parents, Lester and Betty Likens, faced financial difficulties. As traveling carnival workers, they were unable to care for their daughters, and thus, Sylvia and Jenny were sent to live with the Banasiewski family. However, what started as a seemingly simple arrangement would spiral into one of the most brutal and tragic cases of child abuse in American history. Gertrude Banasiewski, a mother of 7, appeared to be a caring figure at first. She took in Sylvia and Jenny with the promise of looking after them while their parents worked to make ends meet. However, it quickly became apparent that Gertrude had a darker side, one that would prove fatal for Sylvia. The Banasiewski family's home became a place of torment for Sylvia, where she endured months of physical, emotional, and psychological abuse. Initially, Sylvia and Jenny were treated relatively well, but as time went on, things began to change. Gertrude's tolerance for the girls began to wane, especially Sylvia, who was accused of being unruly by Gertrude. Sylvia's apparent good nature soon turned into a source of anger for Gertrude, who began to view her as a burden. According to accounts from those who witnessed the abuse, Gertrude would often lash out at Sylvia, calling her derogatory names and belittling her in front of others. What began as minor mistreatment escalated into a campaign of systematic abuse that would ultimately lead to Sylvia's death. Sylvia's fate was sealed when Gertrude, with the help of her children and other neighborhood kids, began to inflict unimaginable cruelty upon her. Over the course of several months, Sylvia was starved, beaten, burned, and subjected to various forms of psychological torment. Gertrude's children, particularly Paula and John Banasiewski, along with a group of local children, took part in the abuse, seeing it as a way to gain favor with Gertrude, or simply out of sheer cruelty. They were encouraged by Gertrude to treat Sylvia like an animal, and they did so without remorse. As the summer of 1965 wore on, Sylvia's torment intensified. She was subjected to daily beatings, burned with cigarettes, forced to eat her own vomit, and deprived of food and water. One of the most shocking aspects of the abuse was the way Gertrude would involve the other children in the violence, using them as instruments of torture. In one instance, Gertrude allegedly instructed her children to write degrading phrases on Sylvia's body with a hot needle, including, "I'm a prostitute," and "I'm useless." The abuse grew increasingly violent, and the physical wounds Sylvia sustained were horrifying. Sylvia's once vibrant appearance was replaced by a gaunt, emaciated body covered in bruises, burns, and other signs of the brutal treatment she was enduring. As she grew weaker and more malnourished, Sylvia's pleas for help fell on deaf ears. She begged for someone to intervene, but the people who were supposed to care for her, Gertrude and her children, only reveled in her suffering. At some point, Sylvia became unable to walk and was confined to the basement of the house, where she was left to die in isolation. She was repeatedly told that she was worthless, and that no one cared about her. Tragically, Sylvia's body began to deteriorate under the extreme conditions, and it became clear that she would not survive much longer. What made the case even more heartbreaking was the fact that Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, was forced to watch as her sibling was tortured and neglected. Jenny, too, was subjected to abuse, but she was not as severely beaten as Sylvia. She witnessed the entire ordeal in horror, unable to help her sister. In some ways, Jenny's presence in the house made Sylvia's suffering even worse, as the emotional abuse Gertrude directed at both girls was often coupled with threats and humiliation. Throughout the entire ordeal, Sylvia never once received help from any adults outside the Banasiewski family. Teachers, neighbors, and friends of the Banasiewski children all witnessed Sylvia's suffering, but no one intervened to stop the abuse. Some believed Gertrude's manipulative nature and charming facade, while others simply turned a blind eye to the horrors unfolding right under their noses. In the months leading up to Sylvia's death, the physical and psychological torment she endured left her barely recognizable. She had been so badly beaten that her body was covered in scars and open wounds. Her ribs were visible from lack of food, and her once bright personality had been completely shattered. Sylvia's physical decline was so severe that even her own family would have had trouble recognizing her had they come to visit. On October 26, 1965, Sylvia Likens succumbed to the relentless abuse she had endured. She died in the Banasiewski home, her body too frail and broken to survive any longer. Sylvia was just 16 years old when she passed away, her life cut short by the very people who were supposed to protect her. Her death was not just the result of physical trauma, but the culmination of a deeply depraved campaign of psychological torture and neglect. The events surrounding Sylvia's death would eventually come to light, but not until it was too late. It was only after her death that authorities were made aware of the horrors she had endured. Jenny Likens, Sylvia's younger sister, bravely came forward and revealed the full extent of the abuse that had taken place. She told police about the beatings, the degrading rituals, and the cruelty that had been inflicted upon Sylvia. Jenny's testimony would become a key piece of evidence in the investigation that followed. Sylvia's body was discovered with marks of extensive abuse, including burns, bruises, and cuts. Her injuries were so severe that it was clear she had been tortured for months before her death. Medical experts would later confirm that she had died from a combination of physical trauma, malnutrition, and shock. After the tragic death of Sylvia Likens on October 26, 1965, the horrifying abuse she had endured came to light, triggering a widespread investigation. Sylvia's younger sister, Jenny Likens, bravely stepped forward to reveal the brutal details of the treatment Sylvia had suffered while in the care of Gertrude Banasiewski and her children. Jenny's testimony would be vital in uncovering the truth, but at first, the authorities had no idea just how deep the cruelty went. The investigation into Sylvia's death began when the authorities were called to the Banasiewski home after a neighbor reported that something was wrong. Sylvia's body was discovered under circumstances that were shocking, and her condition made it clear that she had been subjected to an extensive period of abuse. Medical examiners would later confirm that Sylvia's death was a result of neglect and trauma. She had been starved, beaten, and burned, her body covered in horrific wounds that were a result of prolonged torture. The police initially suspected that Sylvia's death could have been a case of extreme child abuse, but they had no idea just how malicious the actions of Gertrude Banasiewski and her children had been. The investigation revealed that Sylvia had been tortured for months, with no one outside the Banasiewski family stepping in to help. Despite the numerous signs of abuse, teachers, neighbors, and even friends of the Banasiewski children did nothing to stop the violence. The investigation into Sylvia's murder quickly led to the arrest of Gertrude Banasiewski, the woman responsible for the majority of the abuse. Gertrude, a 36-year-old mother of 7, had a history of emotional instability, and it was revealed that she had been a deeply troubled individual for years. She was described by those who knew her as controlling, manipulative, and emotionally abusive. Her personality and behavior had likely contributed to her ability to carry out such a heinous act. and it was soon clear that Gertrude's actions had been nothing short of sadistic. What shocked the investigators even more was the role played by Gertrude's children, especially her oldest daughter, Paula Banasiewski, and her son, John Banasiewski. Both Paula and John had actively participated in the abuse, helping their mother to inflict torment on Sylvia. They, along with several other children in the neighborhood, were charged with various crimes related to Sylvia's death. The involvement of the Banasiewski children was deeply disturbing, as it seemed that they had been raised in an environment where cruelty and violence were normalized. In addition to Gertrude and her children, several other local children were arrested for their role in the abuse. These children, ranging in age from 10 to 15, were encouraged by Gertrude to participate in the torment, and many of them did so willingly. They were instructed to beat Sylvia, humiliate her, and carry out the cruel tasks that Gertrude would often suggest. Some children later claimed that they were coerced into participating, while others admitted to enjoying the cruelty. The involvement of the children in the abuse shocked the public and added a layer of complexity to the case. The trial of Gertrude Banasiewski and the others involved in Sylvia's death would become a national sensation. The trial lasted several months, and the complexity of the case made it difficult to predict the outcome. In the end, Gertrude Banasiewski was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. However, in 1985, her sentence was reduced to 30 years, and she was released on parole in 1985. Many people found this decision deeply upsetting, as they felt that Gertrude's actions had been far too extreme to warrant such a lenient sentence. However, her release sparked outrage among the public, and many people feared that she had not truly paid for the horror she had inflicted upon Sylvia. Paula Banasiewski, Gertrude's daughter, was also found guilty of second-degree murder and was sentenced to 2 years in prison. John Banasiewski, another of Gertrude's children, was convicted of manslaughter and received a sentence of 2 years in prison as well. These sentences raised many questions about the legal system and whether children should be held to the same standards as adults when they commit heinous crimes. Some argued that the Banasiewski children had been influenced by their mother and should not be held as responsible, while others believed that they had played a key role in the abuse and deserved harsher punishment. Story 7. The Beginning of the Nightmare. On the 22nd of January 1992, the peaceful routine of Stephanie Slater's life was violently shattered when she became the victim of a horrific kidnapping. At 25 years old, Stephanie was a cheerful and hard-working estate agent living in Birmingham, England. She had no idea that her life would take an unimaginable turn that day. The day started like any other. She was working at her usual job, showing houses to potential buyers, unaware that she would soon be thrust into a terrifying ordeal that would captivate the nation. Stephanie was assigned to a property located in a suburban area of Birmingham, where she had scheduled an appointment with a man who was interested in purchasing the home. The man, later identified as Michael Sams, had set up the meeting, presenting himself as a potential buyer. He was charming and polite, giving no indication that he harbored dark intentions. He was a man in his 40s, with a calm demeanor, and nothing about his appearance would suggest that he was capable of committing the horrific act that he was about to carry out. Upon meeting at the property, Michael Sams swiftly revealed his true, sinister nature. As soon as Stephanie entered the house, he forced her at gunpoint to the basement, binding her and blindfolding her. In an instant, her life was no longer her own. The estate agent found herself trapped, helpless and terrified, with no understanding of the fate that awaited her. Michael Sams, a convicted criminal with a history of offenses, had planned this abduction with chilling precision. He had been plotting for months, and now his plan was in motion. The true extent of Michael Sams's history as a criminal began to unfold as investigators later uncovered the details surrounding the abduction. Sams had previously been convicted of crimes, including burglary and other violent offenses. However, his most notable and disturbing crime was a series of other kidnappings that led him to be labeled as a dangerous and calculating individual. Despite his previous criminal record, Sams was able to conceal his violent tendencies and present himself as a mild-mannered man to those around him. As the investigation into his background progressed, detectives learned that Sams had harbored a deep resentment for women, stemming from both personal experiences and a twisted perception of power and control. It became evident that Stephanie Slater had been selected not only because of her profession, but also because of his desire to dominate and control her. It was later revealed that he had been fantasizing about committing such an abduction for years. This desire, however, would be different than his prior offenses. He would hold Stephanie captive for an extended period, subjecting her to unimaginable physical and psychological torment. While he held Stephanie in a hidden location, Sams told her that she would only be released once a ransom was paid. He made it clear that her safety depended entirely on whether or not her family could come up with the money he demanded. Sams, in his sadistic manipulation, took great care to keep Stephanie blindfolded for much of the time, further deepening her sense of fear and isolation. The hours turned into days, and the psychological strain on Stephanie became increasingly intense. Stephanie's family, friends, and colleagues were horrified upon learning of her abduction. The police, led by detectives who would later become acquainted with Sam's criminal history, began their search. Despite their best efforts, the case seemed like a hopeless one. Michael Sams had covered his tracks with cunning precision. As the days went by without any substantial leads, the tension grew. The question on everyone's mind was whether they could find Stephanie alive before it was too late. The investigation into Stephanie's kidnapping unfolded with a mix of high tension, uncertainty, and fear. As police worked tirelessly to track down Sams, they uncovered his manipulative tactics. Michael Sams had used every bit of his prior criminal experience to his advantage, making it nearly impossible for the authorities to track him down. During the days of her captivity, Sams maintained a strict control over Stephanie, isolating her completely from the outside world. He gave her very little information about her fate, or whether she would be released, keeping her in a constant state of confusion and dread. Stephanie was forced to write a letter to her family, in which she begged them to pay the ransom that Sams had set for her release. In the letter, she implored them to do whatever it took to bring her back home safely. The police, meanwhile, were doing everything they could to locate the hiding place where Stephanie was being held. Their search was exhaustive, with investigators combing through every lead they could find. They faced a difficult challenge, as Michael Sams had made sure to hide his tracks. It was clear that he had planned the kidnapping in great detail, leaving nothing to chance. He had carefully chosen a location where he could hold Stephanie without attracting attention, and he had made it nearly impossible for anyone to find him. Despite the frustration that the police felt as they pursued leads, there were still glimmers of hope. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when they learned about the nature of Michael Sams' previous offenses. This insight into his past criminal behavior provided law enforcement with important clues that would later help in narrowing down their search. They began to focus their attention on certain areas, slowly tightening the net around Sams, and getting closer to discovering the location where Stephanie was being held. The first breakthrough came when police discovered a connection between Michael Sams and other kidnappings. Sams had a history of criminal behavior, and his previous offenses included burglary and armed robbery. This led investigators to believe that he was a repeat offender who had carefully planned his attack on Stephanie. He knew exactly what he was doing, but his past was beginning to catch up with him. Stephanie, who had been confined to a hidden location, was terrified but remarkably calm. Her resilience in the face of captivity was nothing short of extraordinary. She had little information about her surroundings, and her blindfolded state made it nearly impossible to get any bearings. However, the letters she had written to her family revealed that she was doing her best to keep her spirits up, even in the direst of circumstances. She told them that she was doing everything she could to survive. As the investigation progressed, detectives delved deeper into Sam's history. They discovered that he had been living under an alias for some time, which complicated the search, but they also found links to a network of properties that he had access to, and these became focal points for the police. Sams, who had hidden Stephanie in a secluded house on the outskirts of Birmingham, was eventually traced to an area not far from the city. Despite his careful planning, Sams was not entirely infallible. His criminal history began to catch up with him. The police had established that he had previously been involved in similar crimes, which gave them key insights into his behavior and tactics. The turning points in the investigation came when police traced a series of phone calls that Michael Sams had made from a payphone. The calls were to family members and friends, during which he had attempted to stay one step ahead of the authorities. However, these phone calls became a crucial mistake. Detectives were able to track down the location of the payphone, which was in a small village not far from Birmingham. This breakthrough allowed the police to narrow down their search and focus their efforts on a particular area. The search intensified, and a special team of officers was deployed to comb through the village and surrounding areas. After days of searching, the breakthrough came when they discovered a small, isolated house where they believed Stephanie was being held. The police were cautious, knowing that Michael Sams was armed and dangerous. They launched a coordinated operation, carefully surrounding the house to avoid alerting Sams to their presence. As the tension mounted, the officers prepared for the moment of confrontation. Meanwhile, Stephanie, who had endured days of captivity, had no idea that her rescuers were so close. She remained in a state of fear and uncertainty, unsure of what would happen next. It wasn't until the evening of February 11th, 1992, that the police moved in. Officers stormed the house, catching Michael Sams off guard. Sams attempted to flee, but he was quickly apprehended. He was arrested on the spot and charged with the kidnapping and unlawful detention of Stephanie Slater. The police were finally able to free Stephanie after days of torment, and she was taken to safety. The relief felt by her family and the police was immeasurable. As Stephanie was led to safety, she was shaken but physically unharmed. The emotional toll of her ordeal would take much longer to process. The authorities immediately began to question Michael Sams, who was now in custody. As they did so, they began to piece together the details of his crimes and learn more about his motives. In the days that followed Michael Sams' arrests, police began to interrogate him about the details of the kidnapping. During the interrogation, Sams revealed the extent of his disturbing plans. It became clear that Stephanie had been selected not at random, but because of her occupation as an estate agent. Sams had been watching her for days before making his move. His goal was to hold her captive for an extended period, demand a ransom from her family, and make money off her abduction. His ultimate aim, however, was to exert control and power over her. He enjoyed the thrill of the act and the feeling of domination that came with holding someone hostage. He even went as far as making her write a letter to her family, demanding money in exchange for her release. While the authorities worked to unravel the full scope of his plan, Stephanie was undergoing counseling to help her process her traumatic experience. Her family, who had feared for the worst, were overjoyed to have her back, but they knew that her road to recovery would be long. The police had managed to bring the ordeal to a close, but the emotional scars would remain. The police investigation continued, and it was soon discovered that Sams had a history of similar crimes. He had been convicted of violent offenses in the past, and had served time for burglary and armed robbery. He had also been linked to other unsolved kidnappings. Michael Sams' trial for the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater began in 1993, over a year after his arrest. After several weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated on Michael Sams' guilt. Given the overwhelming evidence, including his capture and the testimony from both Stephanie and law enforcement, the jury had little doubt about his role in the crime. Sams was convicted of the kidnapping of Stephanie Slater and sentenced to life in prison. The conviction was a significant moment in the case, providing a sense of closure for Stephanie and her family. It was a long-awaited moment of justice, marking the end of the legal proceedings against Sams. However, for Stephanie, the real battle was just beginning. She would have to face the emotional aftermath of her captivity and find a way to rebuild her life after such an ordeal. Story 8. The Lufthansa Heist. On December 11th, 1978, a heist took place at John F. Kennedy International Airport in New York that would become infamous for its audacity and scale. Dubbed the Lufthansa Heist, this robbery involved the theft of over $5 million in cash and $1 million in jewelry, making it one of the largest cash heists in American history. The planning was meticulous, the criminals clever, and the execution, for a time, seemed flawless. The mastermind behind the heist was James Burke, a notorious figure in the world of organized crime who was known to associate with the Lucchese crime family. Known by the nickname Jimmy the Gent, Burke was a seasoned criminal who had made his living through racketeering, theft, and other illicit activities. His criminal ties ran deep, and he had cultivated relationships with key figures within the New York Mafia. Burke's reputation for ruthlessness made him both respected and feared. In the months leading up to the heist, Burke gathered a team of thieves, all of whom played an essential role in executing the complex operation. What made the heist particularly daring was the fact that it took place within the confines of a highly secure and heavily monitored airport terminal. The Lufthansa cargo terminal, where the money and jewels were stored, handled high-profile shipments, many of which came from overseas. It was a prime target for Burke and his crew. The plot began with an inside man, a Lufthansa employee named Louis Werner, who worked as a cargo manager at the airport. Werner, who was well connected within the terminal, knew the routines of airport security, the schedules of shipments, and the types of goods that would pass through the terminal. He became a crucial link between Burke and the operation, passing on vital information that would make the heist possible. The plan was simple yet ambitious. Werner fed Burke with details about a shipment that would be arriving from Europe. Millions in cash and precious gems. The shipment was to be transferred to a holding area at the terminal, where it would remain until it was shipped out to its final destination. The thieves would infiltrate the area, overpower the staff, and escape with the loot. Burke knew that if they were going to pull off this heist, everything would need to go according to plan. One misstep could lead to their capture and potentially cost them their lives. Burke carefully selected a crew of 6 men to help him execute the job. Each member was chosen for their specific skill set, whether it was driving, handling weapons, or navigating the airport's layout. The crew included the likes of Henry Hill, a trusted associate, as well as others who had prior experience in criminal activities. They were all familiar with the stakes and the risks involved. The night before the heist, Burke and his team made final preparations. They staked out the airport, watching the movement of workers, noting security procedures, and making sure that their route to and from the terminal was clear. As they surveyed the area, they confirmed that everything was in place. The guards, the timing of the shipments, and the limited access points. They could practically taste the success of the mission. The evening of the heist, the plan was set into motion. It began with Burke's crew making their way to the airport in 2 separate vehicles. The team was well coordinated, with everyone knowing their role and the exact timing of the operation. The goal was to be in and out without alerting anyone. At 3 a.m. on December 11th, the crew made their way inside the restricted section of the Lufthansa terminal. They were armed and ready for anything, but they knew that speed and stealth were the keys to their success. The crew's job was to neutralize anyone in their way, steal the cash and jewelry, and then make a quick getaway before the authorities had time to react. What followed was an operation that, at first glance, seemed to be flawlessly executed. The team entered the terminal, overpowered the small group of workers on duty, and began to load the money and jewels into waiting vehicles. The robbery itself went smoothly. The criminals knew exactly what to do and where to go. Within minutes, they had successfully carried out the heist and made their escape, leaving behind very few traces of evidence. Although they managed to flee the scene before the police arrived, the mistake had already set off alarm bells. The authorities would soon be alerted, and the investigation into the heist would begin. Within hours of the robbery, the FBI and local law enforcement had descended upon the scene at the Lufthansa cargo terminal. The scale of the theft and the precision with which it was carried out had made it clear that this wasn't the work of amateurs. The criminals had neutralized the few security staff on duty, loaded the money and jewels into their getaway vehicles, and escaped with minimal evidence. However, there were still critical leads that investigators would soon follow. One of the first things that investigators noted was the lack of a typical heist structure. Most criminals, when executing a heist of this magnitude, would leave behind obvious clues, fingerprints, items left behind, or mistakes that could be tracked. The crew had managed to avoid leaving these obvious signs, but they had still made some missteps that investigators would eventually use against them. The first major breakthrough came when the FBI examined the security footage from the airport. While the footage didn't capture the robbers' faces, it did show their movements and the vehicles they used. Authorities identified 2 cars as key to the getaway. The investigators quickly traced the vehicles back to known criminals in the area, but the trail was still cold. No one had a concrete lead on who was behind the operation. As the investigation advanced, one key name began to surface repeatedly: James Burke, also known as Jimmy the Gent. Burke's connection to the Lucchese crime family had not gone unnoticed by the FBI. He was a well-known figure in organized crime, and the authorities had long suspected him of being involved in various illicit activities. Though they had never been able to pin anything on him, his criminal ties ran deep, and his reputation for carrying out high-profile robberies made him a prime suspect in the Lufthansa heist. Investigators dug deeper into Burke's activities and past connections. They discovered that Burke had several associates who had ties to the Lufthansa terminal and the shipping of goods. As they traced the web of connections, they found that Louis Werner, the Lufthansa employee who had provided the inside information, was a close associate of Burke's. Werner, it seemed, had been the link that allowed the crew to carry out the heist. Louis Werner was a key player in the heist. His position as a cargo manager at the airport allowed him access to critical information about the shipments, especially the large amounts of cash and jewels that passed through the terminal. He knew the routine of the airport well, when shipments arrived, where they were stored, and the timing of security patrols. Werner's knowledge gave Burke and his crew the upper hand. Once investigators identified Werner as the inside man, they moved quickly to question him. However, Werner's fate had already been sealed. It was soon discovered that he had been brutally murdered. His death was one of the first signs that Burke's crew was not just involved in a heist, but also in a string of violent killings. Burke, it seemed, had a long history of silencing anyone who might implicate him or expose his criminal enterprises. Burke's crew members began to disappear one by one. Those involved in the heist who had been linked to Burke's criminal empire were murdered under suspicious circumstances. It was clear that Burke would not allow anyone to talk, especially not those who knew too much about the details of the Lufthansa heist. One of the first crew members to be murdered was Richard Eaton, who had played a crucial role in organizing the getaway. Eaton's body was found in a ditch, and it appeared that he had been executed. His death was the first of many, and the FBI began to realize that Burke's desire to protect himself and his operation extended to eliminating those who could potentially be witnesses against him. Burke's ruthlessness continued as others involved in the heist met similarly grisly fates. By 1979, several of the crew members had been found dead, each death shrouded in mystery and linked to the larger criminal operation. The authorities couldn't ignore the pattern. Burke was silencing his crew to cover his tracks. Despite the killings, a few key informants came forward who were willing to talk to the authorities. These informants, often former associates of Burke, provided crucial information that helped the FBI connect the dots. It was through these individuals that investigators learned of Burke's habit of eliminating anyone who posed a threat to his criminal enterprises. The first break came when one of Burke's former associates, Henry Hill, a well-known figure in the world of organized crime who would later become infamous for his role in the Goodfellas story, agreed to cooperate with the authorities. Hill's testimony was instrumental in uncovering the full scope of the Lufthansa heist and the subsequent murders carried out to protect it. Hill provided first-hand knowledge of Burke's operations and the role he played in orchestrating the heist. One of the biggest mistakes made by the crew was in the distribution of the stolen money. The criminals, after the heist, had to launder the cash in order to avoid attracting attention. Some of the stolen money was sent through various channels, including gambling rings and illegal businesses. But as the heat on the operation grew, certain crew members began to make mistakes. They trusted the wrong people, and the stolen loot started to surface in unexpected places. The authorities, now armed with information from informants like Hill, began tracking the movements of the stolen cash. They quickly found that the money had begun to filter back into the criminal underworld. This allowed the FBI to zero in on Burke's associates and begin building a case against him. With the mounting evidence against him, Burke could no longer avoid justice. In 1980, he was arrested and charged with multiple crimes, including the Lufthansa heist. However, the case against Burke was not an easy one. While there were several informants who had come forward, the FBI still needed concrete evidence to ensure a conviction. The prosecution built its case using witness testimony, circumstantial evidence, and the confessions of those who had turned on Burke. The case was a high-stakes legal battle, with the criminal underworld watching closely to see how the authorities would proceed. Burke's defense team did everything in their power to discredit the evidence, but the tide was turning against him. In 1982, James Burke was convicted on charges related to the Lufthansa heist and the murder of several people involved in the crime. He was sentenced to 25 years in prison for his role in the heist and for ordering the deaths of those who had helped him carry out the robbery, while he would never stand trial for the actual murder of Louis Werner, one of the key inside men who had given him the information. Burke's conviction marked the end of his reign as a feared figure in the world of organized crime. Story 9. The framing of an innocent man. On a quiet street in Notting Hill, London, a dark story began to unfold in the 1940s and early 1950s. At 10 Rillington Place, an unassuming terraced house, one of Britain's most infamous serial killers, John Reginald Halliday Christie, carried out a string of horrifying murders. To his neighbors, he was a quiet and polite man. To his victims, he was a manipulative predator who used deceit and his knowledge of chemistry to commit his crimes undetected for years. John Reginald Halliday Christie was born on April 8, 1899, in Halifax, England. From an early age, he exhibited troubling behavior. He had a strained relationship with his parents, and his childhood was marked by isolation and an inability to form meaningful social connections. As a young man, he struggled with various jobs, serving in World War I before later becoming a postman, and then a clerk. Despite his seemingly ordinary life, there were signs of something deeply disturbed beneath the surface. Christie's first encounters with the law were minor offenses, petty theft, fraud, and violent outbursts. But these early crimes hinted at a man with a growing disregard for morality. In the 1920s and 1930s, he served time in prison multiple times for theft and assault. But these offenses paled in comparison to what he would go on to commit at 10 Rillington Place. In 1938, Christie and his wife Ethel moved into the ground floor flat of 10 Rillington Place, a dilapidated house in London's Notting Hill district. The house was a cramped, grimy place, with peeling paint, creaking floorboards, and an air of decay. Yet for Christie, it provided the perfect cover for his dark intentions. The area was known for its working-class residents, many of whom were struggling to make ends meet. With the backdrop of World War II and post-war hardship, transient tenants, immigrants, and struggling families frequently moved in and out of the neighborhood. It was the perfect environment for a predator like Christie to operate without drawing suspicion. His first known murder occurred in 1943, during the height of World War II. His victim was a woman named Ruth First, a 21-year-old Austrian woman who had been working as a munitions factory worker. Christie lured her into his flat, strangled her, and buried her body in the back garden. This killing ignited something inside him, a thirst for control and death that would only grow stronger. Shortly after, he claimed another victim, Muriel Eady, a co-worker whom he tricked into believing he had a cure for her chronic bronchitis. Using his knowledge of chemicals, Christie administered a toxic substance before strangling her and burying her in the same garden as Ruth. For years, Christie lived a double life. To his wife and neighbors, he was the quiet, respectable man who had served his country and worked as a postman. But behind closed doors, he was a sadistic killer, refining his methods and waiting for his next victim. In 1948, a young couple, Timothy and Beryl Evans, moved into the upper floor flat of 10 Rillington Place. Timothy was a 25-year-old van driver with limited education, and Beryl was his 20-year-old wife. They had a baby daughter, Geraldine, and were struggling financially. Beryl became pregnant again, but the couple could not afford to raise another child. Desperate for help, they confided in their downstairs neighbor, John Christie. He claimed he had medical experience and could perform an abortion, a dangerous and illegal procedure at the time. Beryl, seeing no other option, agreed to let Christie help her. What happened next remains one of the greatest miscarriages of justice in British history. Christie killed Beryl under the pretense of the abortion and then murdered baby Geraldine. When Timothy Evans returned home, Christie manipulated him, convincing him that Beryl had died accidentally and that he should leave town to avoid trouble. Evans, panicked and naive, fled to Wales, where he later confessed to the police, though his confession was inconsistent and riddled with contradictions. The police investigation that followed was shockingly inadequate. They took Christie's word over Evans, dismissing evidence that could have pointed to Christie as the real killer. In January 1950, Timothy Evans was wrongfully hanged for the murders of his wife and daughter. After the wrongful execution of Timothy Evans in 1950, John Reginald Halliday Christie was free to continue his crimes at 10 Rillington Place without scrutiny. But as the years passed, his depravity deepened, and his need for control escalated. Between 1950 and 1953, he refined his methods, luring victims into his home with false promises before ending their lives in the most horrific ways imaginable. With no one suspecting him of any wrongdoing, Christie began to escalate his killing spree. He had already taken the lives of Ruth First, Muriel Eady, and Beryl and Geraldine Evans. But now his bloodlust grew insatiable. Between 1952 and early 1953, he would claim the lives of at least 4 more women, each of whom he lured into his home under the guise of kindness or medical assistance. Christie had devised a sinister technique. He would offer assistance, often medical in nature, before rendering his victims unconscious with a homemade gas apparatus connected to the kitchen's coal gas supply. Once they were incapacitated, he would strangle them with a rope, and, in some cases, engage in necrophilic acts before disposing of their bodies. Among his final victims were Rita Nelson, a 24-year-old Irish woman who was pregnant at the time of her murder. She had been looking for assistance when Christie offered his help. Kathleen Maloney, a homeless woman Christie lured into his home with the promise of food and shelter. Hectorina McLennan, a Scottish woman who had been living in poverty. Like the others, she was deceived into thinking Christie was a kind benefactor. All 3 women met the same fate: gassed, strangled, and hidden within the house. But perhaps the most shocking of all was his final known victim, Ethel Christie, his own wife. By 1952, Christie's carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble. He had lost his job and was living off his wife's meager earnings. With no income and a house full of secrets, he made a chilling decision. He would kill the one person closest to him. In December 1952, Christie strangled Ethel in her sleep. Unlike his previous victims, he did not attempt to dispose of her body in the garden or bury her under floorboards. Instead, he placed her body under the bed and continued living in the house, surrounded by death. Without his wife as a stabilizing presence, Christie spiraled further into darkness. He invited more women into his home, used the same deadly tactics, and then stuffed their bodies into a small alcove behind the kitchen wall. By early 1953, Christie had become financially desperate and had fallen into arrears with his rent. Unable to maintain his residence at 10 Rillington Place, he forged a lease to sublet his flat to unsuspecting tenants and disappeared. On March 24, 1953, new tenants moved into the house and quickly complained about the foul odor emanating from the walls. Upon further investigation, they made a gruesome discovery. Behind the kitchen wall were the remains of 3 women, their bodies contorted and partially decomposed. The authorities were immediately called, and a full search of the property uncovered even more horrors. Ethel's body was found under the floorboards, and skeletal remains of Ruth First and Muriel Eady were unearthed from the back garden. The extent of Christie's crimes became clear. He had turned his home into a graveyard. With the discovery of the bodies, a nationwide manhunt for Christie was launched. However, he had already fled Rillington Place. Wandering through London in a disheveled state, He drifted between lodging houses, slept on park benches, and spent his final days as a fugitive avoiding capture. But his time was running out. On March 31st, 1953, a policeman patrolling near Putney Bridge spotted a suspicious-looking man loitering in the area. When asked for identification, the man hesitated, and upon further questioning, he admitted his identity: John Reginald Halliday Christie. He was immediately taken into custody, bringing an end to one of Britain's most chilling murder sprees. At first, Christie was reluctant to speak, but as the weight of his crimes bore down on him, he slowly began to confess. He admitted to the murders of his wife, Ethel, and the 6 other women found at 10 Rillington Place. However, he initially denied any involvement in the deaths of Beryl and Geraldine Evans, maintaining that Timothy Evans had killed them. This contradiction was a crucial moment in the case. Investigators knew that Christie's lies had led to the wrongful conviction and execution of Evans in 1950. If Christie had killed Beryl and Geraldine, as many had long suspected, then Evans had been hanged for crimes he did not commit. As days passed, Christie's story changed. He eventually admitted that he had, in fact, strangled Beryl Evans after persuading her to let him help with an abortion. However, he continued to deny any involvement in the murder of Geraldine, even though all evidence suggested otherwise. Despite his confessions, Christie attempted to portray himself as a man tormented by uncontrollable urges. He claimed he killed women because he was mentally ill, and he tried to plead insanity. But the methodical nature of his crimes, and the fact that he had been able to hide them for so long, suggested otherwise. On June 22, 1953, Christie's trial began at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, in London. On June 25, 1953, after less than 2 hours of deliberation, the jury found John Christie guilty of murder. The judge sentenced him to death. Following his conviction, Christie was held at HM Prison, Pentonville, the same prison where Timothy Evans had been executed just 3 years earlier. The irony was not lost on the public. Christie, the true murderer, now occupied the same condemned cell as the man he had framed. On the morning of July 15, 1953, Christie was led to the gallows. The executioner, Albert Pierrepoint, a veteran hangman responsible for many of Britain's most infamous executions, carried out the sentence. At 9:00 a.m., John Reginald Halliday Christie was hanged. His execution brought an end to one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. But the impact of his crimes would continue to be felt for decades. Story 10. The saddening case of Junko Furuta. On November 25, 1988, Junko Furuta, a 17-year-old high school student from Misato, Saitama, Japan, left school for what should have been a routine walk home. She had dreams of a bright future, having recently secured a job at an electronics company after graduation, but she never made it home. What followed was a nightmare so horrific that it remains one of Japan's most infamous and disturbing criminal cases. Junko Furuta was known as a kind, responsible, and diligent student. She avoided trouble, excelled in her studies, and was well liked by her peers. Unfortunately, she caught the attention of Hiroshi Miyano, an 18-year-old with connections to the Yakuza. Miyano had a reputation for being violent and dangerous, and when he tried to pursue Junko romantically, she politely rejected him. This rejection would seal her fate. Determined to exact revenge, Miyano and his friend Nobuharu Minato devised a sickening plan. They would abduct Junko, and what followed would be a 44-day ordeal of unspeakable suffering. On the night of November 25th, Miyano and Minato waited near a park, looking for a target. They spotted Junko riding her bicycle home. Miyano approached her, pretending to be a stranger, and knocked her off her bike. Before she could react, Minato, posing as a concerned bystander, offered to walk her home safely, but instead of taking her home, they led her to a warehouse, where Miyano revealed his true intentions. He assaulted her and called his gang associates, boasting about what he had done. They then transported her to Minato's family home, a place that would soon become Junko's prison. Minato's parents and brother lived in the house where Junko was being held. Yet, despite hearing her pleas for help, they did nothing. The gang threatened to kill them if they intervened, and so they turned a blind eye. Junko's ordeal was about to begin. A horrific period of captivity, torture, and abuse that would last for over a month. As the days passed, Junko's family grew frantic. She'd never stayed out overnight before, and her disappearance made headlines. But in a twisted move, Miyano forced Junko to call her parents, telling them she had run away and was staying with a friend. Fearing she would be harmed, she complied. The police, believing she had left voluntarily, did not investigate further. Junko was held captive in Minato's bedroom, which quickly became her prison. The gang tied her up and beat her repeatedly, laughing as they inflicted unimaginable pain. At first they allowed her to wear clothes, but soon they stripped her of even that dignity. She was tortured daily, with their captors using everything from lighters to sharp objects to metal rods. They invited friends and other gang members to take part in the abuse, with reports estimating that over 100 different people assaulted her. Some of them came and went, treating the Minato house like a den of horror, where Junko was nothing more than a victim for their sick games. Despite the constant torment, Junko clung to life, even attempting to escape multiple times, but each attempt only led to more brutal punishments. The most shocking part of this case was the fact that Minato's parents and brother lived in the same house. They knew a girl was being tortured under their roof, yet they chose to stay silent. At first they pleaded with Minato to release her, but he and his friends threatened to kill them if they intervened, rather than standing up against their own son. The Minato family looked the other way. Even when Junko's cries of pain echoed through the house, no one stepped in to help her. She was completely alone, trapped in a house where no one cared if she lived or died. At one point, Miyano forced her to call her parents and tell them she had run away but was safe. Terrified, she obeyed, despite the pain in her voice. Her parents were desperate for answers, but with no way to locate her, they could do nothing. Meanwhile, police had received a tip about a missing girl being held at the Minato home. Officers even visited the house, but when Minato's parents assured them there was no girl inside, they left without searching. Junko Furuta was still inside, broken and suffering, only feet away from salvation. Junko's condition had deteriorated so much that even her abusers were taken aback. Her body was swollen, bruised, and covered in burns from cigarettes and hot wax. The fractures in her legs made it nearly impossible for her to stand, and the severe internal injuries made it excruciating to eat or drink. Her tormentors grew bored of her suffering. They no longer saw her as entertainment because she couldn't react as much anymore. Instead of stopping, they decided to use her as a punching bag, testing how much more pain she could endure. Despite everything, Junko never gave them the satisfaction of begging for her life. On January 4th, 1989, the torture took its final, irreversible turn. That day, Miyano and the others beat her with iron bars and set her legs on fire after she refused to entertain them. As the flames burned her already infected wounds, she suffered a seizure. Instead of calling for help, the gang mocked her condition, pouring more flammable liquid on her legs. Hours later, she lost consciousness. The next morning, Junko Furuta was dead. Her captors, now realizing what they had done, began to panic. Rather than report her death, the gang decided to get rid of her body in the most callous way possible. They placed her remains inside a 55-gallon oil drum, filled it with wet concrete, and abandoned it in a remote industrial area. To outsiders, Junko Furuta had simply disappeared. Her captors believed they had erased her existence, but they had underestimated how their crime would unravel. It wasn't until several weeks later, in February 1989, that the case began to unravel. The remains of Junko Furuta were discovered by a construction worker who found the barrel while working in a secluded area near the city of Kawasaki. Inside the barrel was the mummified body of a young woman her identity unrecognizable due to the severe decomposition and injuries. A forensic examination revealed that she had suffered from numerous traumatic injuries: broken bones, burns, sexual assault, and more. The injuries to her legs, arms, and torso indicated extended periods of torture before her death. As detectives worked to identify the woman, they eventually found a match. The police learned that Junko Furuta had been missing since November 25, 1988, after she had been abducted by Miyano and his gang. Her family was contacted, and DNA tests confirmed her identity. The news was devastating, and police immediately focused their investigation on Miyano and his associates. Their involvement in Junko's death was soon confirmed when they discovered that Miyano, Minato, Ogura, and Watanabe had been involved in her abduction and captivity. After Miyano and the other suspects were arrested, they initially denied any involvement, but the evidence quickly piled up. Interviews with witnesses revealed that the gang had a long history of violence, and their behavior had escalated to the point where they had begun kidnapping girls to torture them. The trials of the 4 men responsible for Junko Furuta's death were nothing short of disturbing. The details of their actions, which had remained hidden for so long, came to light, and the public was horrified by the depravity of what had occurred behind closed doors. In court, it was revealed that Miyano, the ringleader, had a history of violent behavior, and had previously been involved in sexual assault and robbery. His accomplices, Minato, Ogura, and Watanabe, were also found to have committed multiple crimes, but had been involved in Junko's kidnapping and death, specifically out of a desire to impress Miyano. The men were found guilty of kidnapping, torture, rape, and murder. And the courtroom was filled with tears from both the public and Junko's family. In the aftermath, the 4 men were sentenced, but the court's decision was met with outrage. Miyano was sentenced to death, while Ogura, Minato, and Watanabe were given sentences ranging from life imprisonment to 20 years. However, public outrage over the perceived leniency of their sentences was immense. Miyano's death sentence was seen as the only justice, but the other men's sentences were widely criticized as insufficient for the crime they had committed. Story 11. A young life changed forever. On the night of July 7, 1993, a young woman's life was stolen when she walked through the streets of Seattle, heading home after a late-night gathering with friends. Mia Catherine Zapata was born on August 25, 1965 in Louisville, Kentucky. From a young age, she showed an interest in music, learning to play the piano and guitar. Inspired by blues and punk rock, she developed a powerful voice that blended raw emotion with poetic lyricism. In the mid-1980s, Mia moved to Ohio to attend Antioch College, where she met the future members of her band, the Gits. The group quickly gained a reputation for their high-energy performances and socially conscious lyrics. Their music was aggressive yet deeply emotional, with Mia's voice carrying a unique blend of anger and vulnerability. By the early 1990s, the Gits had relocated to Seattle, a city that was becoming the epicenter of the grunge movement. Bands like Nirvana, Soundgarden, and Pearl Jam were dominating the airwaves, and the Gits were carving out their own space within the underground punk scene. With Mia at the helm, they were gaining recognition, playing shows alongside some of the biggest names in alternative rock. Mia wasn't just a musician, she was a force of nature. Friends and fellow musicians described her as fiercely independent, deeply compassionate, and committed to using her music to give a voice to those who felt unheard. But on that fateful night in July 1993, Mia's voice was silenced forever. On the evening of July 6, 1993, Mia had spent time with friends at the Comet Tavern, a well-known bar in Seattle's Capitol Hill neighborhood. She left around 1 a.m., planning to walk back to a friend's apartment where she had been staying. It was a familiar walk, just a few blocks away, and Mia had made it many times before. But she never made it. At approximately 3:30 a.m., a man walking his dog in the Central District, a few miles from where Mia had last been seen, made a horrific discovery. Lying in the middle of the street was the body of a young woman. She had been brutally beaten and strangled with the drawstrings of her own hoodie. Her body showed signs of a violent struggle, and later, forensic evidence would confirm that she had been sexually assaulted. It wasn't until later that morning that authorities identified the victim as Mia Zapata. The Seattle music scene was shattered by the news. Fans, friends, and fellow musicians were in shock. How could this happen to someone so beloved, so talented, and so full of life? As news of Mia's murder spread, grief turned into anger. Seattle's music scene was already known for its tight-knit community, but now it was united in fear. If Mia Zapata, a strong, independent woman, could be taken so violently from the streets, what did that mean for everyone else? Her bandmates and the Gits were devastated. They had been on the verge of signing a major record deal, and now their lead singer, their friend, was gone. In the wake of Mia's murder, the band members channeled their grief into action, helping to create Home Alive, a self-defense organization dedicated to teaching women how to protect themselves. The organization held benefit concerts featuring major artists, including Nirvana's Chris Novoselic and Pearl Jam's Eddie Vedder, to raise awareness about violence against women. But despite the overwhelming support and attention, the police had little to go on. There were no witnesses, no suspects, and no immediate leads. The investigation into Mia Zapata's murder quickly became a cold case. From the very start, investigators knew that Mia had put up a fight against her attacker. Her body showed clear signs of a struggle, and DNA evidence was recovered from her remains. Unfortunately, in 1993, forensic science was still developing, and DNA databases were not widely accessible. The Seattle Police Department processed what little they had, but there were no matches in their system. Detectives interviewed Mia's friends, family, and bandmates, hoping that someone might have insight into who could have targeted her. However, Mia had no known enemies, and there were no immediate suspects. There were also no signs that she had been followed or threatened before her death. Rumors spread within the Seattle music community, and some people even speculated that Mia's killer might have been someone who knew her. The police explored various possibilities, including the idea that she had been targeted by someone she met that night. But with no concrete evidence, the investigation quickly reached a standstill. In the early 2000s, forensic science was advancing rapidly. DNA testing had improved significantly, and law enforcement agencies across the country were using new technology to solve old cases. In 2002, the Seattle Police Department decided to take another look at Mia Zapata's murder. They sent the DNA sample recovered from her body to CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database, which had grown significantly since the early 1990s. For nearly a decade, the sample had remained unmatched. But now, everything changed. In 2003, a hit came back. The DNA matched a man who had never even been on the police's radar. His name was Jesus Mezquia, a Cuban immigrant living in Florida. Police had never connected Mezquia to Seattle before. He had no known ties to Mia Zapata or the city's music scene. But now, science had placed him at the scene of the crime. When police began digging into his past, they uncovered a disturbing history. Mezquia had a record of violence against women, with previous arrests for assault and domestic abuse. These crimes had not been severe enough to keep him in prison for long, but they painted a picture of a man with a dangerous past. Detectives worked to establish Mezquia's whereabouts in 1993. Records showed that he had been living in the Seattle area at the time of Mia's murder. Though there was no known connection between the two, he had left the state not long after the killing, eventually relocating to Florida. With the DNA evidence and his history of violence, detectives believed they had enough to make an arrest. In 2003, nearly 10 years after Mia's murder, police traveled to Florida and took Jesus Mezquia into custody. The prosecution's case against Mezquia relied primarily on the DNA evidence, which had remained preserved for a decade. Scientists testified that the probability of the DNA belonging to anyone other than Mezquia was virtually non-existent. His DNA had been found on Mia's body, proving that he had been in direct contact with her the night she was killed. In addition to the forensic evidence, prosecutors pointed to Mezquia's history of violence against women. Though none of his previous crimes were as brutal as Mia's murder, they established a pattern of predatory behavior. The prosecution argued that Mia had been randomly targeted. She had no known connection to Mezquia, making the crime all the more chilling. Defense attorneys attempted to cast doubt on the DNA evidence, arguing that the presence of Mezquia's DNA did not necessarily mean he was responsible for Mia's death. However, they struggled to explain how his DNA could have ended up on her body unless he had been involved in the crime. As the trial unfolded, Mia's friends, family, and bandmates attended the proceedings, hoping for justice after nearly a decade of uncertainty. The courtroom was filled with emotion as those who had known and loved Mia heard the gruesome details of her final moments. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated on the case. The evidence against Mezquia was overwhelming, and in 2004, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. The verdict brought a sense of relief to Mia's loved ones, though the pain of her loss would never fully fade. At sentencing, Mezquia was given 36 years in prison, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. While no punishment could bring Mia back, her family and friends finally had closure. Story 12. The Origin of the Amber Alert. Story 12. The Origin of the Amber Alert. On January 13, 1996, a 9-year-old girl named Amber Hagerman was riding her pink bicycle in a parking lot near her grandmother's home in Arlington, Texas. It was a quiet afternoon, and she was just minutes away from safety when a stranger snatched her away in broad daylight. Amber Renee Hagerman was born on November 25, 1986, in Arlington, Texas. She was a bright, energetic child who loved to ride her bike and play with her little brother, Ricky. Raised by her mother, Donna Williams, Amber was known for her warm personality and sense of adventure. She had dreams of becoming a teacher one day, and like many girls her age, she adored Barbie dolls and had a collection she cherished. Amber's family lived in a modest neighborhood in Arlington, where she and Ricky spent much of their time visiting their grandparents, Jimmy and Glenda Whitson. It was a safe, tight-knit community, one where children could usually play freely without worry. However, the illusion of safety would be shattered on that fateful January afternoon. It was a Saturday, and Amber and Ricky were eager to enjoy the afternoon. Their mother Donna had taken them to visit their grandparents, as she often did on weekends. Shortly after arriving, the two children asked if they could ride their bikes near the abandoned Winn-Dixie parking lot, just a few blocks away. Their grandmother, Glenda, hesitated at first, but ultimately agreed. She reminded them to stay close and be careful, as any loving grandparent would. Ricky, being younger, turned back home after a short while, but Amber decided to keep riding. Then, in a matter of seconds, everything changed. A nearby witness, 78-year-old Jimmy Kevill, happened to be in his backyard when he saw a terrifying scene unfold. He later described seeing a black pickup truck pull up beside Amber as she rode alone. A man jumped out, grabbed her off her bike, and threw her into the truck. Amber screamed and kicked, desperately trying to fight off her attacker. But the man acted quickly, slamming the door shut and speeding away before anyone could stop him. Kevill ran inside and called 911 immediately. He described the suspect as a white or Hispanic male, under 6 feet tall, with a medium build and dark hair. The truck he drove was a full-size single cab, black pickup with no markings or windows. When Amber's family heard what had happened, panic set in. Her mother rushed out into the streets, screaming Amber's name. Within minutes, police arrived, and a citywide search began. But the abductor had vanished. The Arlington Police Department immediately launched an intensive investigation. Officers went door to door, questioning residents and searching for surveillance footage that might have captured the suspect's truck. Helicopters were deployed to scan the area, and volunteers joined law enforcement in the frantic effort to bring Amber home. Amber's disappearance also caught the attention of the media. Her face was broadcast across Texas, and news stations urged the public to report any sightings. Flyers were printed and distributed throughout the community, pleading for information. Despite the quick response, hours turned into days, and days turned into heartbreak. 4 days after Amber's abduction, on January 17, 1996, A man was walking near a creek behind an apartment complex about 4 miles from where she had been taken. As he neared the water, he spotted something horrific. A child's lifeless body partially submerged in the creek. Authorities were immediately called, and within hours, Amber Hagerman was officially identified. The discovery devastated the community, shattering the small hope that had remained for her safe return. The autopsy revealed the horrifying details of what Amber had endured. She had been brutally assaulted and left in the water. Despite efforts to determine exactly how long she had been in the creek before being found, the heavy rains over the past few days had made it difficult to pinpoint an exact timeline. The only certainty was that Amber's killer had murdered her and disposed of her body in a way meant to erase evidence. Amber's case quickly turned from a search and rescue to a murder investigation. But despite the urgency, there was very little for detectives to go on. The best clue remained the eyewitness account from Jimmy Kevill, who had seen Amber being taken in the black pickup truck. However, beyond that, there were no fingerprints, no DNA evidence, and no additional witnesses. Investigators believed Amber had likely been held captive for at least 2 days before she was killed. But where had she been, and why did her abductor decide to murder her rather than keep her alive? Theories emerged about the suspect. Some believed it was a local predator who had been watching Amber for some time. Others suggested it was a crime of opportunity, where the abductor saw her alone and took his chance. There was also speculation that the killer might have had previous offenses. Perhaps someone who had kidnapped before, but had never been caught. Despite national media coverage and a $75,000 reward offered for information leading to an arrest, the investigation remained at a standstill. Amber's murder deeply affected people beyond just her family and the local community. Diane Simone, a woman from Dallas, had been following the case closely. She couldn't understand why there hadn't been an immediate broadcast when Amber was taken. Why weren't people in the area immediately warned to be on the lookout? Diane suggested the idea of a national emergency alert system for abducted children, much like weather alerts or emergency broadcasts. By 1997, 1 year after Amber's death, the first Amber Alert system was launched in Texas. It allowed police to quickly disseminate information to radio stations, television networks, and later electronic billboards and cell phone alerts. Over the next few years, other states followed suit, and by 2003, President George W. Bush signed the PROTECT Act, which established a nationwide Amber Alert system. Today, Amber Alerts are issued across the United States, Canada, and several European countries. The system has saved over 1,100 children since its inception. Each time an Amber Alert is broadcast, it serves as a reminder of the little girl who never made it home, Amber Hagerman. Story 13. An artistic heist. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston houses some of the most priceless works of art in the world. Its collection, personally curated by the eccentric and wealthy Isabella Stewart Gardner, became a treasured cultural landmark. However, in the early morning hours of March 18, 1990, 2 men posed as police officers entered the museum and executed the largest art heist in history. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, located in Boston's Fenway neighborhood, was founded in 1903 by its namesake, Isabella Stewart Gardner. A passionate art collector, Gardner spent decades amassing an extensive collection of paintings, sculptures, and rare artifacts. The museum itself was designed to resemble a Venetian palace, with a grand courtyard, intimate galleries, and a strict rule. Isabella's was stipulated that nothing in the museum could be changed or moved. By 1990, the museum's prized collection included works from Rembrandt, Vermeer, Manet, and Degas, all housed within elaborate rooms filled with centuries-old masterpieces. It was considered one of the most valuable private collections in the world. But despite the museum's prestige, security measures were shockingly inadequate. While the museum contained hundreds of millions of dollars worth of art, its security was not up to the standards of major institutions like the Louvre or the Met. Some of the biggest vulnerabilities included no armed security personnel. Only 2 unarmed guards worked overnight shifts, No motion detectors in the galleries, except for pressure-sensitive alarms on some paintings. A lack of external surveillance cameras, meaning no video footage existed outside the museum. A reliance on an old alarm system, which alerted police only if a painting was physically removed from the wall. These weaknesses would soon be exploited in the most audacious way imaginable. At 1:24 a.m. on March 18, 1990, the two night guards, Rick Abath and Randy Heston, were nearing the end of their shift. The museum was silent. Suddenly, two men dressed as Boston police officers rang the museum's side entrance buzzer. They told the guards they were responding to a reported disturbance, despite museum protocol stating that guards were never to let unauthorized personnel inside. Abath buzzed them in. As soon as the men entered, it was clear something was wrong. One of the officers looked at Abath and said, "You look familiar. We have a warrant for your arrest." Before Abath could react, the officer ordered him to step away from the security desk. Within moments, both guards were overpowered. The imposters revealed their true intentions almost immediately. They forced both guards against a wall, duct-taped their mouths, and handcuffed them. The thieves then took an extra step. They tied the guards with additional duct tape and secured them in the museum's basement. With the only two security personnel neutralized, the thieves were now free to move through the museum without resistance. Unlike many smash-and-grab burglaries, this heist appeared carefully planned. The thieves did not rush through the museum. They spent an astonishing 81 minutes inside, choosing their stolen works deliberately. They targeted 13 pieces of art, including the Concert by Vermeer, one of only 34 Vermeer paintings in existence, valued at over $250 million. Christ in the Storm on the Sea of Galilee by Rembrandt, his only known seascape, a priceless masterpiece. A Lady and Gentleman in Black by Rembrandt's Tortoni. By Manet 5 Sketches by Edgar Degas. A bronze eagle from a Napoleonic flag. What puzzled investigators later was that several even more valuable works were left untouched. The museum housed paintings by Michelangelo, Botticelli, and Raphael, yet the thieves ignored them. At one point during the heist, the thieves attempted to unscrew Rembrandt's self-portrait etching from its display case, but gave up and left it behind. They also removed a large Chinese vase, but ultimately abandoned it on the floor. This suggested that either they were rushed or had specific targets in mind. After 81 minutes, the thieves finished loading the stolen artwork into a vehicle and disappeared into the night. The next morning, when the day shift security guard arrived, he found the museum silent. Unable to contact his co-workers, he called the police. When officers arrived, they found the two night guards still tied up in the basement. The paintings had been ripped from the walls, leaving behind empty frames, a haunting sign of the crime that had taken place. When museum staff and investigators assessed the damage, the true scale of the heist became clear. $500 million worth of art had been stolen, making it the largest theft in history. The FBI took over the case, declaring it one of the highest priority art crimes ever. A $10 million reward was offered for information leading to the painting's recovery. Despite an intensive investigation, no arrests were ever made. The case grew colder, and the stolen art, masterpieces that could never be sold openly, remained missing. When the authorities were called to the scene, they discovered an eerie silence. Empty frames where masterpieces once hung, the guards tied up in the basement, and no sign of the culprits. The initial confusion was compounded by the lack of physical evidence left behind. No fingerprints, no DNA, and no clear trail leading to the perpetrators. The FBI was quickly brought in, and the museum cooperated fully with the investigation. Their extensive security footage had not captured the crime itself, as the thieves had disabled the alarm system and cameras before entering. The museum's alarm system, which relied on the removal of the paintings to trigger an alert, had proven ineffective in stopping the crime. One of the first lines of inquiry was the possibility that the crime had been carried out by professionals with intimate knowledge of the museum. The methodical nature of the heist, the careful removal of artworks, the selection of specific pieces, and the absence of chaos suggested that the thieves knew exactly what they were doing. This led authorities to believe the perpetrators were highly skilled in art theft, possibly connected to organized crime. The FBI launched a nationwide search for the stolen pieces, reaching out to art dealers, auction houses, and museums across the world. They also expanded the search to Europe, where stolen artworks were often hidden or sold. The pieces were included in international databases, and the reward offer was publicized widely. Despite the massive efforts, the artwork remained invisible, and the case continued to grow colder with each passing year. Over the years, the case has become one of the most famous unsolved art crimes in history. The missing works of art are considered priceless and are unlikely to ever be recovered. Story 14. America's Biggest Fraudster. Frank Abagnale's life of crime began at a young age, yet it would quickly evolve into one of the most intricate and daring criminal careers the world had ever seen. Born in Brooklyn, New York in 1948, Frank's story would be defined by deception, audacity, and an almost supernatural ability to manipulate his surroundings. From the start, Frank's early life seemed marked by instability. Raised in a broken home, with his parents divorcing when he was just 16 years old, Frank became disillusioned and rebellious. His father, a successful businessman, struggled with the emotional strain of the divorce and began to distance himself from his son, which only pushed Frank deeper into a spiral of dishonesty and deceit. By the time Frank reached his teenage years, he began experimenting with small cons. It was here that Frank's gift for manipulation first began to show. He would practice the art of lying with ease, using his charm and quick thinking to escape from situations that others could never have. Frank became adept at convincing others to believe his fabricated stories, a skill that would become his greatest asset as his criminal career unfolded. At the age of 16, Frank committed his first real crime. He ran away from home, using his father's credit card and identity to travel across the United States. It wasn't long before Frank realized that he could live a lavish life by assuming other people's identities, particularly in professional settings. His first big break came when he successfully posed as a pilot for Pan Am, an act that would become legendary. Using his ability to forge documents, Frank created a fake pilot's license and took to the skies, becoming one of the most wanted criminals in the world at just 18 years old. This audacious scam was only the beginning of a series of highly sophisticated impersonations that would continue to fool the authorities for years to come. Frank's ability to mimic the life of a pilot was impressive enough, but what followed was even more shocking. After his success as a fake Pan Am pilot, Frank moved on to a new persona. A doctor. This time, he wasn't just a young man playing pretend. He conned hospitals into hiring him as a licensed pediatrician. Frank's charm, confidence, and ability to deceive those around him had reached new heights. Using forged diplomas and references, he was able to gain access to the medical field and even work in multiple hospitals, all while being a teenager with no medical qualifications whatsoever. As Frank continued to adopt new personas, his skills at document forging and improvisation grew stronger. He not only became a doctor, but also assumed the role of a lawyer and even a professor, all before the age of 21. Frank's ability to manipulate systems and authorities became increasingly refined, and his exploits started to make headlines across the United States. He was a master of deception, using the innocent trust of others to his advantage. As Frank's criminal career continued, his confidence grew, and so did the scale of his cons. He started to exploit financial institutions, forging checks and falsifying identities in a way that no one had ever seen before. His cons weren't just about personal gain. They were about the thrill of outsmarting those around him and proving his superiority over the system. The fact that he had eluded authorities for so long was a testament to his cunning and his deep understanding of human psychology. Frank's activities also expanded beyond the United States. As he started to operate internationally, he forged passports, created false identities, and even engaged in high-level fraud in Europe. It was clear that Frank Abagnale was not just a petty criminal. He was a world-class con artist, whose criminal empire knew no bounds. He had become an elusive figure, always one step ahead of the law. By the time Frank turned 21, He had already committed thousands of crimes, each more elaborate and daring than the last. The authorities were starting to catch on to his pattern of fraud, forgery, and impersonation. But they didn't yet know his name or who was behind these crimes. His manipulation of the system had remained unmatched, but he had made one critical mistake. The more people he deceived, the more he drew attention to himself. It wouldn't be long before the FBI began investigating his growing web of crimes. The FBI, however, was not easily deterred. As Frank had forged documents, fake IDs, and even phony passports, their investigation relied heavily on traditional methods of tracking criminals, including interviews, databases, and tips. Still, Frank was a moving target. He kept changing his identity and position. He was able to stay one step ahead of the FBI at all times, but law enforcement soon began to form a profile of this young man. A charming, articulate individual with a knack for manipulating authority. As Frank continued his criminal escapades, his ability to dodge the authorities became more legendary. The FBI's pursuit of Frank Abagnale went beyond just one manhunt. It was now an international operation. He had jumped from state to state, and sometimes country to country, evading capture for years. Authorities, both in the US and overseas, were coordinating their efforts to catch him. But Frank's deep knowledge of the legal system and his ability to forge documents kept him ahead of the law. During this time, Frank continued to create an even more elaborate web of fake identities. He assumed the persona of a physician, attorney, and professor, holding down respectable jobs while exploiting his positions for profit. He didn't just steal money, he exploited people's trust on a level that authorities hadn't seen before. And despite all of this, Frank was still able to blend into society, hiding in plain sight as he carried out his deception. The breakthrough in the investigation came when Frank made his first major mistake. He overstayed his welcome in a new location. In 1971, after years of eluding capture, Frank's luck finally ran out when he assumed the identity of a pilot one too many times. In the midst of a particularly brazen con, he was arrested in France, not in the US, but overseas, where he was caught impersonating an airline pilot. It was this careless mistake that would eventually lead to his downfall. The arrest was not easy, however. Frank's manipulative powers were so strong that he even attempted to deceive local authorities using it. But after a long investigation and months of pursuing leads, Frank was finally caught and arrested by the French police. He was charged with numerous offenses, including fraud and impersonation. During his time in French custody, Frank's wit and charm didn't fade. He attempted to negotiate with the French police, offering them deals and trying to get them to reduce his sentence. But the law was clear. Frank had broken the law on an international scale, and he couldn't escape the consequences. It was only a matter of time before he was sent back to the United States to face his charges. In 1976, Frank Abagnale was extradited to the United States to stand trial for his crimes. By this time, he had already become a notorious figure in the criminal world. The authorities, however, were determined to hold him accountable for his deception, fraud, and impersonation on a global scale. But what the law didn't anticipate was Frank's ability to work his charm, even in prison. He'd been a master manipulator all his life. And now, in prison, he would try to use those same skills to escape a harsh fate. During his trial, Frank did something surprising. He pleaded guilty to several of the charges against him. But in doing so, he agreed to assist the FBI in identifying and understanding the methods he had used to carry out his frauds. This decision would ultimately change the course of his life. Instead of being sentenced to decades in prison, Frank was given an incredibly reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation. In 1974, at the age of 26, Frank was sentenced to just 12 years in prison. But even during his time behind bars, Frank's life would take yet another remarkable turn. It wasn't long before authorities realized that Frank had valuable knowledge that could help them track down and catch other criminals using similar methods. Frank's expertise in forgery, fraud, and identity theft made him an invaluable resource to law enforcement. While serving his sentence, Frank Abagnale began working with the FBI and other law enforcement agencies. His role was to assist in identifying and tracking fraudsters who were operating in ways similar to his own past activities. At first, it seemed like a strange arrangement, having a convicted criminal helping the authorities. But Frank proved to be a highly effective ally. He was able to help the FBI train agents on how to spot fraudulent behavior, particularly when it came to identity theft and the manipulation of official documents. His insider knowledge was invaluable, and soon he was regarded as a fraud prevention expert. His work with the FBI was pivotal in advancing methods of investigation and securing documents to prevent criminals from following in his footsteps. Frank was an unconventional hero, once a criminal mastermind, now an advisor and consultant for the very institutions he had once deceived. His transformation wasn't immediate, but his willingness to contribute positively to society marked the beginning of his redemption. After serving just 5 years of his 12-year sentence, Frank's cooperation with the authorities earned him an early release. In 1979, at the age of 31, Frank was granted parole and released from prison. His life on the outside was far different from the one he had lived as a master of deception. He now had a second chance, but he had to prove that he could make a positive impact. With the FBI's endorsement, Frank went on to work as a consultant and advisor for various organizations. Story 15. A saddening kidnapping. On the 19th of August 2017, Savannah Greatwing, a 22-year-old Native American woman from Fargo, North Dakota, was in the final stages of her pregnancy. Just a few weeks away from her due date, Savannah was looking forward to the birth of her first child, a daughter she had named Hastily Joe. At the time, she lived in an apartment with her family, including her mother, brother, and partner. The young woman, known for her vibrant personality and big heart, was excited for the new chapter in her life. On that fateful day, Savannah stepped out of her apartment to visit a neighbor, 32-year-old Brooke Cruz, who lived across the hall. Brooke, who was also pregnant at the time, had previously asked Savannah to help her with the sewing project. Savannah, ever the helpful friend, had agreed to come by and lend a hand. As she made her way to the apartment, her family had no reason to suspect anything unusual. But by the evening, Savannah had disappeared without a trace. Her family became concerned when hours passed, and Savannah did not return. Her phone went unanswered, and attempts to reach her by other means were unsuccessful. The situation quickly escalated when her mother, Norberta LaFontaine, reached out to the local authorities, reporting her daughter missing. The search for Savannah would soon uncover chilling details of the crime that had unfolded in their community. The authorities were quick to respond to the situation, and soon, law enforcement officials were actively searching for Savannah. Her disappearance was especially concerning due to her being pregnant and so close to her due date. Her family, alongside the police, began canvassing the neighborhood, hoping to find any trace of Savannah. They questioned neighbors, checked surveillance footage from nearby areas, and even spoke to people Savannah had been in contact with earlier that day. However, it wasn't long before investigators began to focus on Savannah's last known location, which was the apartment of Brooke Cruz. While Brooke had initially reported that Savannah had left her apartment and never returned, the lack of answers from her, and the fact that she was the last person to have seen Savannah, raised suspicions. Brooke's suspicious behavior and vague statements about Savannah's departure caught the attention of law enforcement. Subsequent investigation revealed that Brooke's partner, 32-year-old William Henry Hone, had been involved in the disappearance as well. Both Brooke and William were questioned, but their stories didn't add up. As the search for Savannah intensified, law enforcement was starting to piece together a picture of what had happened. After several days of searching for Savannah, police decided to revisit Brooke Cruz's apartment in the hope that they might uncover something new. Despite her initial reluctance, Brooke was finally brought in for questioning again. During the second round of interviews, investigators noticed her increasingly inconsistent and evasive responses. Her actions raised more questions than answers, prompting the authorities to focus even more closely on her. Meanwhile, as the investigation pressed on, William Hone, Brooke's partner, was questioned as well. The couple's relationship was reportedly unstable, and there was growing evidence that Hone had been involved in the disappearance. Law enforcement began to believe that the pair were hiding something, and their suspicions only deepened when they discovered a strange occurrence that had unfolded in the days following Savannah's disappearance. On August 24, 2017, 5 days after Savannah had gone missing, a terrifying discovery was made. Officers received a tip-off that led them to a house in the neighboring town, Barnesville, Minnesota. A woman had seen a baby stroller in the back of a vehicle, which seemed out of place. Inside the vehicle, law enforcement found a newborn baby girl. The daughter Savannah had been carrying. The infant was alive and healthy, but was still in the car seat, with no one around to claim her. At this point, the investigation had already taken a dark turn. As the police delved deeper into the details surrounding the baby, they uncovered something far more sinister. The truth about Savannah's fate was about to be revealed. The discovery of the baby was a pivotal moment in the investigation. As authorities pieced together the puzzle, they began to suspect that Savannah's pregnancy had been central to the horrific crime. It was quickly determined that the baby, Paisley Joe, was indeed Savannah's daughter. But what had happened to Savannah herself? The breakthrough came when investigators began searching Brooke Cruz and William Hone's apartment more thoroughly. In what would soon prove to be a key piece of evidence, blood was found inside the apartment. This blood was later confirmed to be Savannah's, and it became clear that something horrific had taken place within those walls. The pieces were falling into place. Savannah had been killed, and the couple had been involved in her tragic murder. Investigators soon learned that the crime had been premeditated. Brooke and William had been planning for some time to take Savannah's baby, and in the process, they had executed a plan to murder her. Savannah had been lured to their apartment under the false pretense of helping with a sewing project. But once there, Brooke and William had attacked her, likely with the intention of taking the baby and raising it as their own. But the truth didn't end there. As police continued to investigate, they discovered that Brooke Cruz and William Hone had been trying to kidnap a child for weeks. They had been following Savannah, and even watched her as she went about her daily life. It was a chilling revelation that painted a dark picture of their twisted intentions. Brooke and William were arrested shortly after the baby was found. They were charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy in connection with Savannah's death. The couple's actions had led to a tragedy that devastated not just Savannah's family, but the entire community. It was clear now that the couple had acted out of desperation and greed, willing to go to unspeakable lengths to fulfill their horrific desires. The trial of Brooke Cruz and William Hone began in 2018, and it was met with shock and disgust by the community. Savannah's family and friends attended the proceedings, struggling to comprehend the senseless violence that had taken their loved one's life. The courtroom became a place where emotions ran high, as prosecutors revealed the disturbing details of the crime. Brooke Cruz was particularly vilified during the trial. Prosecutors painted a picture of a woman who had been obsessed with having a child, willing to go to great lengths to fulfill her dream of becoming a mother. She had carefully planned Savannah's abduction and murder, using her as a means to take the child she could never have on her own. The court heard how Brooke had manipulated William Hone into carrying out the heinous crime. He, in turn, had been a willing participant in the plot, assisting Brooke in the abduction and murder of Savannah. While William initially denied any involvement, the evidence against him was overwhelming, and the case against both defendants seemed clear. After months of hearings and testimonies, the case against Brooke Cruz and William Hone came to a head. In 2019, both defendants were found guilty. Brooke Cruz was convicted of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, while William Hone was found guilty of kidnapping and conspiracy to commit kidnapping. Brooke Cruz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, while William Hone received a life sentence as well, though with the possibility of parole after 20 years. The sentencing provided a sense of relief to Savannah's family, who had been seeking justice for their loved one, while no sentence could ever undo the pain caused by the murder. It was a small step toward closure. Thanks for tuning in with CrimeWave Radio. If you're still awake, let me know what your favorite case was from this episode.